Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Critical Theory in Germany on the Way into the 21st Century by Samuel Salzborn. It looks like Samuel, but I've been told by Google Translate that in German it's pronounced Samuel or Samuel. Something like that. I'm probably still getting it wrong, but I'm trying my best here, people. Alright, so critical theory has been one of the most influential schools of thought for the social sciences and humanities in the 20th and 21st centuries. However, its institutional anchoring in Germany's university system has remained considerably less established than is the case with critical rationalism and rational choice theory, for example. Critical theory emerged in Germany in the 1920s, shaped by an interdisciplinary impetus and inspired by perplexing anomaly seen in society around the turn of the century. In the wake of a materialist critique of the political economy, as had been authoritatively developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, there prevailed a certain puzzlement in the 1920s among intellectuals in Germany and across Europe. This was because the objectively seen social conditions, which should have, according to Marx and Engels, certainly resulted in a socialist revolution, had instead failed to ignite any class consciousness or revolutionary potential among the majority of the working class. Quite contrarily, as would soon be seen in the 1930s, there were large segments of the blue-collar and white-collar workforce that not only lacked revolutionary ideals in the socialist mold, but actually supported counter-revolutionary ideas and had a strong affinity for fascist and Nazi beliefs. For the circle of young intellectuals surrounding Max Horkheimer, this perplexing anomaly had already prompted them in the 1920s to explore why certain objectively seen social and/or economic constellations had indeed failed to bring about the consequences that would be expected in theory. The resulting critical theory utilized the trailblazing insight of Marxist social theory and also challenged its historically deterministic assumptions by recognizing the social theory potential of psychoanalysis, thereby connecting it to the question of the subject-object relationship within the interplay between history and society. The hope and faith found in a materialist critique of political economy thus gave way to critical theory's realism, which many have also seen as pessimism, no longer letting yourself be led by utopian desires, but instead continually subjecting society to critique, one that will never lack an objective investigation, so long as society remains bound up in society's own economic and social contradictions. Frankfurt in the 1920s thus saw the foundation of a small institute that would become a launching pad for radical social criticism, one that always strove for interdisciplinarity because the totality of bourgeois society demanded it. This new critical theory would soon be a thorn in the side of the rising National Socialist movement. The young intellectuals associated with Max Horkheimer, Theodor W. Adorno, and Erich Fromm were forced to emigrate, eventually finding, after various European detours, a welcome in North America. This is where the major studies into National Socialism and fascism were developed. The cornerstone for the empirical study of worldview development was laid, and the groundwork for various large-scale social theory projects was established. While some critical theorists like Franz L. Neumann and Herbert Marcuse stayed in the United States after the defeat of National Socialism, others like Horkheimer and Adorno worked in Frankfurt during the 1950s and 1960s, where Horkheimer and Adorno, amongst others, managed to reestablish critical theory in Germany, despite massive resistance from the political and academic systems. In the scholarly histories of critical theory, there now exist extensive works on the history of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, alongside multiple intellectual biographies on Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Fromm. However, the history of critical theory certainly does not end with the death of Adorno and Horkheimer, and by no means has it been adequately recounted if all attention since the 1980s has been focused exclusively on Jürgen Habermas, who has been considered, especially in the German-speaking world, the main heir to critical theory, rightly or wrongly. In terms of scholarly history, It is striking how the establishment of critical theory has always remained rudimentary at Germany's universities. Even though critical theory has decisively shaped the ideas of social research and humanities research in Germany, right up into the present day, this is precisely why the intellectual history of critical theory since the death of Adorno needs to be reconstructed. This reconstruction is particularly aimed to discover both the commonalities and contradictions and to show how these might ultimately be connected to one another. New section. A bottled message without addressees. A bottled message without addressees. But with what sender? It was during the American exile of the Frankfurt Institute of Social Research that Theodor W. Adorno became fascinated with the metaphor of the message in a bottle, although this image is explicitly mentioned just twice in Adorno's body of work. Quote, even at that time, the hope of leaving behind messages in bottles on the flood of barbarism bursting on Europe was an amiable illusion. The desperate letters stuck in the mud of the spirit of rejuvenescence, and were worked up by a band of noble human beings and other riffraff into highly artistic but inexpensive wall adornments. End quote. Adorno. Even though it has been said in reference to the Adorno-Marcuse debate about theory versus practice in regard to the German student movement of the late 1960s, that the bottle has since been, quote, uncorked, end quote, and that critical theory has found an addressee, an idea admittedly corresponding more to Marcuse's understanding and not to that of Adorno, the fascination of this metaphor still remains, not only for considerations of critical theory, but also for the possibilities and limitations of critical social research in general. It is a metaphor that was contextualized in the following by Horkheimer and Adorno in their dialectic of enlightenment, although only implicitly, quote, if there is anyone today to whom we can pass the responsibility for the message, we bequeath it into the, quote, masses, end quote, and not to the individual who is powerless, but to an imaginary witness, lest it perish with us, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. The unaddressed message in a bottle, the unknown witness, these both illustrate the desperate placelessness of critical theory, which, if it will not intellectually corrupt itself, cannot throw in its lot with the totality of bourgeois socialization, where it neither belongs and yet is not excluded either, and which in its ambivalent placelessness can only kindle a subjective hope by not kindling hope itself. Adorno's assertion that the whole is untrue, meaning that nothing, not even one's own thoughts, can escape the suspicion of ideology, structurally demarcates the possibility of truly uncorking the bottled message, of finding a real addressee. However, if one further pursues the history of critical theory, this metaphor of a message in a bottle holds yet another contradiction. Although the bottled message had no addressee, it still had at least senders, in the form of Adorno, Horkheimer, and others, and in view of the debates concerning the continuities and fractures in the development of critical theory since the 1970s, these senders seem to have become not only more diverse, but also less identifiable. And so, as we begin this outline of critical theory perspectives at the start of the 21st century, one could certainly come up with the idea that it is not only the addressee who is unknown, but that the bottle senders have also become just vaguely distinguishable figures in the fog. In asking who are the senders of the bottled message since the 1970s, some have taken the easy route and said that the first generation of critical theory was succeeded by a second one largely associated with the work of Jürgen Habermas, in whose footsteps came Axel Honneth as a major representative of the third generation, to be followed in turn by Rainer Force, either as a parallel or a subsequent development, depending on one's analysis. All of them further developed the legacy of critical theory, especially at the traditional stronghold of Frankfurt, and could thus be justifiably seen as the touch-bearers of the Frankfurt School, a label that had shifted from an external sobriquet to a self-assumed one, who continually adapted it to each period's context. Others, seeing a departure from the socially critical ambitions of critical theory, when Habermas turned critical theory to communicative issues, have taken an equally easy route by saying that the senders of the bottled message after Adorno and Horkheimer could include many other people, like Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Oskar Necht, Regina Beckerschmidt, Alex Demirovich, and Detlef Clausen. but certainly not Habermas and his followers. What is striking about this contested attempt to designate the true inheritors, a project still pursued with much zeal today, is that the very idea of asking who has preserved and further developed the real or, quote, true, unquote, core of critical theory is in itself a contradiction of its goals, precisely because it is impossible for anyone to justifiably and dogmatically claim to have developed a way of thinking in social critique that never succumbs at any point to the totality of modern socialization, without having to constantly question the possibility of this danger in a process of self-reflection and criticism. Although Franz L. Neumann is right in saying that no critical thinking can avoid having some last minimal trace of metaphysics, it is equally important to never stop trying to avoid it, precisely because of its inevitability, not despite its inevitability. Focus here is on a, quote, deontic framework, end quote, as stated by Jürgen Ritzert. Let me see if there's a thing for Jürgen Ritzert. Let's see. Come on. It's not really, it just says he's a sociologist. Okay. The focus here is on a, quote, deontic framework, end quote, as stated by Jürgen Ritzert, which is fundamental to the prospect of emancipation, whereby the, quote, defining of the relationship between the subsumption model and emancipation model of subjectivity, end quote, should result in, quote, neither a culturally pessimistic establishment of absolutes under the subsumption model, nor in a strict disjunction, end quote. Jürgen Ritzert. Therefore, those who would appoint themselves the final arbiters in the question of who then are the legitimate successors to the critical theory of Horkheimer and Adorno must also stand under suspicion of promoting an ideology, having ennobled their own reasoning at least to the point of enthroning themselves to pass this judgment. In other words, any attempt to reflect upon differing critical theory approaches, if it is to avoid negating itself as precisely the opposite, should focus not only on the deviations but also on the potentials, and not only on the identical and the desire for harmony but also on the non-identical and the resulting desire for ambivalence. The critical stance remains torn between belonging and not belonging. At an interminable site in social theory, beyond certainties, and free in a twofold sense, free of prescription, but also free of certitude, with the only certainty being the recognition of that which is untrue. The only surety is uncertainty, resisting the mania for the identical, the unquestioned and the ideological, while constantly doubting intellectual and political dogmas. Critical theory thus situates itself as a social and intellectual non-place that is characterized by both inclusion and exclusion. It is only by engaging with this condition, analyzing it both empirically and theoretically, that a useful contribution can be made to critical thought. However, there is always the omnipresent danger that this all-inclusive approach might ultimately reinforce the very structures that underpin injustice. Any certainty of having avoided becoming part of the ideological is itself undermined as yet another form of ideology. If critique is to form the methodological premise, then all that remains of critique in political terms is the torn, the non-identical, and the ambivalent, being inside and yet always outside. Within this self-contradictory, potentially irreducible ontological core of critical theory lies a space of possibilities, one that has been multiple concretized in the wake of Adorno and Horkheimer, but which itself remained, and must remain, ambivalent, is the core of an emancipatory philosophy that is radical because that philosophy is negative. An emancipatory philosophy for the structurally unfree subject in bourgeois society, quote, Critical theory has no specific influence on its side, except concern for the abolition of social injustice, end quote. I don't know whose quote that is, but I guess Adorno, Horkheimer. In this postulate, seemingly trivial, and yet on closer inspection highly ambitious, Horkheimer's dictum on maintaining the non-identical and the negative as a central element of critical theory is linked to Adorno's categorical demand that people, quote, arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen, end quote. If one understands the negative nature of critical theory from this ambivalence, which in its subject orientation tries to reduce the individual's every suffering, but in its society orientation never wants to align itself with totalizing socialization, then one sees not only the two poles of social theory that have historically been accented in different ways since Horkheimer and Adorno, but also a contradiction. Because if one intellectually turns towards the subject, this will necessarily bring along relativizations in the categorical goal of negative conceptualization. But if one emphasizes the negative dialectic of structure-analytical social theory, the claims of the subject will melt away in the refusal of any turn to the positive. Here the crucial point is that the goal of critical theory with regard to the ideas of Horkheimer and Adorno lies precisely in this negotiation between subject orientation and society orientation, and that while the two are bound together in a state of tension, this relationship is not only ambivalent, but also indissoluble, due to their need for one another. While the subjective experience of suffering has an objective dimension in the form of socialization, which is made structurally recognizable through the concept of alienation, the concrete experience of suffering remains a deeply subjective act, and although its objective causes, with regard to bourgeois socialization and the commodity-producing society as structural determinants, are nameable and thus stand at the focus of critique, this also does violence to the subject a second time, especially if this critique does more than just say that something should not be, but goes on to concretely develop utopian alternative visions, thus shifting its critical capabilities into constructivism. For if one is to take this critical stance seriously, then its epistemological goal is precisely this, quote, to lend a voice to suffering, end quote. It is here through this suffering that social totality is expressed, in a way that is entirely individual but nonetheless mediated or conveyed, quote, for suffering is objectivity that weighs upon the subject, end quote, says Adorno, and, quote, suffering's most subjective experience, its suffering's expression, is objectively conveyed, end quote. It is precisely this inescapable conveying or mediation at the heart of bourgeois totality that burns down into the seismographic epicenter of critical thinking. What does seismographic? Does that just mean big? I have no idea what seismographic means. Seismographic. A seismometer is an instrument that responds to ground noises, and such as caused by quakes, volcanic eruptions, and explosions. They are usually combined with a timing device and a recording device to form a seismograph. All right. So what does that mean? Quaking or shaking and a shaking epicenter? Anyway, let me read the sentence. It's precisely this inescapable conveying or mediation at the heart of bourgeois totality that burns down into the seismographic epicenter of critical thinking. Not wanting to become complicit remains the constant drive working against any concretized promise of salvation. It is a drive that takes seriously its responsibility to the subject by refusing to make utopian assurances and sweeping promises. Therefore, when Adorno says there cannot be right life amidst wrongs, Adorno points to the indeterminability of what could be considered right. However, the ambition of critical theory to achieve both a subjective orientation and a society orientation is in itself paradoxical and utopian. perhaps coming closest to Jewish eschatology in its hopeful stance. And this ambivalence means that continual readjustment is required, so that the defining feature of the differing lines of tradition and critical theory may actually be the varying ways in which they spell out the relationship between these two radical poles. So one could, with complete justification, accuse Habermas of abandoning the goals of negative social theory through his theory of communicative action. Did I say Habermas? Sorry, now I feel like I'm looking in the rearview mirror and it's like checking to see if I hit a kid. So one could, with complete justification, accuse Habermas of abandoning the goals of negative social theory through his theory of communicative action. But at the same time, one would also have to consider that this may have happened in the context of a radical hope for subjective emancipation, just as one could, with equal justification, criticize the lack of subject orientation in regulation theory works that focus on the transformations of capitalistic socialization while still expressing understanding for attempts at a negative development of social theory. If this variability is taken seriously, then it is less possible to speak of, quote, illegitimate, end quote, lines of tradition than of distinctively developed lines of connection that have, in further developed in critical theory, while drawing oneself upon either of these options, been part of critical theory for just as long, and one project for the dawning 21st century could now be to investigate whether and how these lines of tradition might be brought back into a constructive interrelationship. To put it more succinctly, my thesis is that any line of thought claiming to pursue critical theory should be taken seriously only when it strives for one of the two options, a subjective orientation with the goal of reducing subjective suffering, or a society orientation based on a negative theory of modern socialization, and its potential for critical theory should be measured against this standard, but without taking the corresponding gap or blind spot of the other side and making it into a morally exaggerated focus for criticism, which incidentally would also thwart the methodological idea within critical theory of developing a self-contradictory logic in the dialectic between immanence and transcendence, and would thus be capable of producing only an abbreviated and one-sided critique that is superficial and not immanent. Therefore, a strategy for improving understanding within critical theory could involve highlighting once again the lines of connection between different forms of critical theory, but without mistaking these for commonalities. New section, Impulses from Frankfurt. In developing a, quote, theory of totalitarian late capitalism, end quote, as Helmut Dubiel called it, or Helmut Dubiel, who is a German sociologist, what's it say? Helmut Dubiel studied German literature and philosophy at the universities of Bielefeld and Bochum. He was visiting professor at UC Berkeley and New York University from 1998 to 2002 before returning to his position as professor of sociology at the University of Gießen, where he has taught since 1992. In 1982, at the age of 46, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And that's what one biography says of him. So back to the text. In developing a, quote, theory of totalitarian late capitalism, end quote, as Helmut Dubiel called it, the focus for critical theory was on a sociological and socio-psychological analysis. Was on sociological and socio-psychological analyses of culture and society, particularly critiquing how modern socialization is negotiated and mediated. The resulting works of critical theory, whose main proponents, beyond the social philosopher Max Horkheimer and sociologist Theodor W. Adorno, included the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, social philosopher Herbert Marcuse, sociologist Leo Löwenthal, economist Friedrich Pollock, cultural philosopher Walter Benjamin, and jurist Otto Kirchheimer and Franz Leopold Neumann, were an attempt to juxtapose a Marxist-inspired social theory and historical interpretation with a Freudian-inspired psychoanalysis. The point of departure for the work of Frankfurt's Institute for Social Research in the 1920s and 30s was to examine why certain social theory presumptions that had been formulated in the context of dialectical and historical materialism, e.g. those concerning the class consciousness of the workers, had not become historical reality, especially in a situation where the objective reality of economic crisis would actually seem to demand it. To explain this and related anomalies, critical theorists focused on trying to integrate psychoanalytical approaches into historical and social theory, thereby systematically introducing the unconscious factor, and to overcome the historically deterministic outlook with its materialistic approaches that had prevailed until then. Although the scope of critical theory categorically evades concrete definition due to wider dynamics affecting society, one can generally say that the classical works of critical theory were shaped by sociological and socio-psychological questions and were dominated by research into anti-Semitism, authoritarianism, and Nazism, as well as critiques of ideology, the Enlightenment, aesthetics, and mass culture and society, including its mediation on the level of character structures and family structures. The Institute for Social Research, Institut für Sozialforschung, IFS, were heterogeneous during its Paris sojourn, and even more so during its New York exile, and this heterogeneity continued with the paths trod after its return to Frankfurt, not only due to the diversity of people participating in the project of critical theory, but also particularly due to their diversity of academic fields, resulting at best in interdisciplinary projects, such as the group experiment. I don't know what the group experiment is, but more often resulting in fragmentary convergences, where epistemological and methodological approaches met and mutually inspired one another, before once again diverging to continue along their separate lines of critique. So that their connections to the project of critical theory were of different intensities, and their inspirations from other fields of social sciences and the humanities, and their mutual interplay with these, were of different extents. Detlef Clausen, I have a piece by Detlef Clausen that's from one of, I believe, it's from one of Marcel Stutzler's books on anti-Semitism. Detlef Clausen describes with impressive intensity this Frankfurt academic climate as a juxtaposition of many different streams and intellectual presences, shaped not only by, quote, academic relations of dependence, end quote, and rivalries, but also acting first and foremost like, quote, a giant laboratory where both old and young were attempting to develop a critical social theory for the present day, end quote. In this description, Clausen focuses on the milieu of the Institute for Social Research and the Sozialistischer Deutscher Studentenbund, or German Socialist German Student League. But even the very proximity of the Institute for Social Research and the AFE Tower, where the social science departments were housed, was itself symbolic of the highly charged moment that galvanized social critique and stimulated the analysis and evolution of critical theory, thereby making Frankfurt into a hub whose impulses projected in countless directions. These emanated most intensely from Adorno, also on a personal level until his death, and to some extent from Horkheimer, but also from, as Clausen emphasizes, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, Alfred Schmidt, and Oscar Necht. What is more, one can further understand the impulses that emanated from the Frankfurt academic milieu, which was heavily shaped by critical theory, a field that inspired other lines of social criticism and formatively influenced them, by recalling a few names of those who participated in socially critical dialogue and absorbed impulses from critical theory, but then thoroughly connected them to other lines of socially critical analysis, as can be seen in the work of Irving Fetcher. Okay, so Irving Fetcher, I'll look him up. But Irving Fetcher was a very important person who I don't think people know very much about. But he was like a Marxologist in Germany during in like the 60s and 70s. Oh, he lived for a long ass time. I'll read his little Wikipedia entry. Irving Fetcher. Oh, he was also the professor. He was Moishe Bastone's, I believe Moishe Bastone's advisor on one of his academic projects. Yeah, it says on his Wikipedia actually that he was a doctoral student. Irving Fetcher, who lived from 1922 to 2014, damn, lived a long ass time, was a German political scientist and researcher on Hegel and Marxism. Fetcher was born on the 4th of March 1922 at Marbach am Neckar and was brought up in Dresden. After the Second World War, Fetcher studied at Tübingen and Paris, receiving a doctorate in 1950. Fetcher belatedly published his thesis Hegel's Lehre vom Menschen in 1970. He habilitated in 1959 with a dissertation on the political philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. From 1963 to 1988, Fetcher was professor of political science and social philosophy at the Goethe University Frankfurt. Fetcher is identified with the second generation of the Frankfurt School along with Jürgen Habermas and Alfred Schmidt. Leszek Kolakowski, he was like one of the guys who wrote the main currents of Marxism. He was a Marxist and then not a Marxist. Leszek Kolakowski, while taking Fetcher to be a distinguished historian of Marxism with a critical but positive attitude, did not see him as of the Frankfurt School more than notionally. By 1976, Fetcher published his own version of The Wolf and the Seven Young Goats by the brothers Grimm, Die Geiss und die Sieben Wölflein, The Goat and the Seven Young Wolves, as part of the children's book Update on Rumpelstiltskin and Other Fairy Tales by 43 authors, compiled by Hans Joachim Gelberg, illustrated by Willi Glassauer, and published by Belz and Gelberg. In 1993, Fetcher was honored with induction into the French Ordre des Palmes Académiques. Fetcher died on the 19th of July, 2014. So that's who Irving Fetcher is. But I have a piece by Irving Fetcher. It's like something like Marx's Concretization of Freedom, which was from Erich Fromm's The Socialist Humanist Symposium book, which I think is just called Socialist Humanism. It says Ingeborg Mauser is a professor, born 1937, is a professor emeritus of political theory and the history of ideas at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. Her biography here is kind of long. It says her effect. I don't know. This is a translation from the German Wikipedia. So, Mauss is considered a representative of proceduralist democratic theory. Given the indeterminacy of freedom and equality, their concretization can only be achieved in the democratic legislative process by all human rights subjects gathered. There is a mutual dependency relationship between human rights and popular sovereignty. Quote, liberal rights only become inviolable when it is not the powerful but the powerless who decide how to use their freedom, end quote. Mauss criticized the increasingly deformalization of positive law as made possible in Carl Schmitt's legal conception, among other things by a distinction between the Constitution and constitutional law. From the work of Immanuel Kant, Mauss develops an ambitious conception of popular sovereignty from which he criticizes legal invocations of a positive legal right of resistance as, quote, refeudalizing, end quote, a, quote, refeudalizing, end quote, form of decay. Mauss transfers the arguments against a world state mobilized by Kant in On Eternal Peace into a conception of the autonomy of democratic learning processes against which military interventions, even if they are legitimated on moral and humanitarian grounds, regularly violated. So that's who that is. Alfred Lorenzer. Alfred Lorenzer, who lived from 1922 to 2002, was a German psychoanalyst and sociologist, regarded as a pioneer of interdisciplinary psychoanalysis. He integrated the psychological, the biological, and sociological dimension in the science of man, especially with regard to psychoanalytic theory. Sorry, all these people are new to me, so I have to look them up because I'm anal. Erlich Uvermann, who lived from 1940 to 2021, was a German sociologist and university professor. From 1977 until his retirement in 2008, Uvermann held the chair for sociology and social psychology at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. He founded Objective Hermeneutics. It says, and in the section, this is translated from the German Wikipedia. It's under a section titled Positions and Research Focuses. Since 1969, Erlich Uvermann has been developing the method of objective hermeneutics as part of his research into socialization theory and family sociology. Since Uvermann's appointment to a professorship in sociology with a focus on social psychology in Frankfurt in 1970, Uvermann has tried to test this method and the procedures that can be derived from it in many subject areas and to confront it with data types from the social sciences, cultural sciences, and humanities. This process can be considered complete since around 1994. Since then, he has worked intensively to implement this method in clinical sociology and socioanalysis. In addition to family sociology and socialization research, Uvermann's main research and work focuses were the theory of professionalization, the reconstruction of interpretation patterns and habitus formations, the sociology of language and knowledge, and the sociology of religiosity. Researchers who work according to the method of objective hermeneutics founded, together with Uvermann, the Objective Hermeneutics Working Group in the legal form of an association in 1992. The association, which is recognized as a non-profit organization, promotes hermeneutic social research. So that's Ulrich Uvermann, and the last person is Alexander Misterlich. Alexander Misterlich is a psychologist who lived from 1908 to 1982. Where am I? Try to look for what his work was about. Yeah. His biography details are kind of boring. Says from the 1960s, alongside the protagonists of the Frankfurt School, the Misterlichs, I guess, includes his wife, I'm guessing, played an important part in post-war Germany's intellectual debates, employing psychoanalytic thought for explaining the causes behind Nazi Germany and Nazi Germany's aftermath in German society to the present day. The first major book they wrote together was The Inability to Mourn: Principles of Collective Behavior, first published in 1967, discussing why the Holocaust, the war crimes, and the sentiment of guilt on the offender's part were not dealt with adequately in post-war German society. Mr. Lick pointed specifically to the Germans' inability to mourn their beloved leader, Adolf Hitler. Another important book Alexander Mr. Lick wrote was Die Unwertlichkeit unserer Städte, Anstiftung zum Unfrieden. The inhospitality of our cities, a deliberate provocation. First published in 1965, that deals with the societal and psychological consequences of urban planning and architecture in post-war Germany. Late in this period, in 1969, Mr. Lick was the analyst of author Erika Jong, who stated, quote, "He was the first person that took me seriously as a writer. He helped me break through a lot of barriers in my work. He changed my life," end quote. So, that's who Alexander Mr. Lick was. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but okay, now that I've said who all those people are, I need to reread the sentence that they were in. What is more, one can further understand the impulses that emanated from the Frankfurt academic milieu, which is heavily shaped by critical theory, a field that inspired other lines of social criticism and formatively influenced them, by recalling a few names of those who participated in socially critical dialogue and absorbed impulses from critical theory. But then thoroughly connected them to other lines of social critical analysis, as can be seen in the work of Eileen Fetscher, Ingeborg Maus, Alfred Lorenzer, Erlich Uwermann, and Alexander Mitscherlich. Or Mitscherlich, I don't know. Historically contextualized in this way, a picture also emerges that is different from most prominent portrayals of the, quote, Frankfurt School, end quote, such as famously depicted by Wigerhaus. Wigerhaus is an intellectual historian of the Frankfurt School. This picture is less oriented towards inheritances, baton passing, and linear continuities, in the words of Detlef Clausen. It is not about a, quote, typical biblical family conception featuring the potential heritability of intellectual products, end quote, or as said by Rainer Forst in similarly questioning this model, a, quote, family with generations of descendants, some close, some distanced, end quote. In the end, any inheritance/generational model would have to remain rather straightforward and in this respect oblivious to the dialectic of inspiration and interaction, simply due to the fact that Habermas was clearly the chronological successor to Horkheimer in his professorial chair, making him, in the absence of any direct successor to Adorno, the direct and only, quote, heir, end quote, to critical theory in academic terms. Therefore, instead of adopting an inheritance model, the historical picture should be oriented more toward influences, inspirations, and self-contradictions, and perhaps also negation, of which Horkheimer once said, quote, the method of negation, the denunciation of everything that mutilates mankind and impedes mankind's free development, rests on confidence in man, end quote. This confidence in humanity, which clearly must be disappointed again and again, is based precisely on its coherent and contradictory nature. Negation itself, as a genuine methodological challenge to critical theory, is not in itself reified, but is instead reflected by the twists and turns that happened between the IFS and the AFE Tower in the 1970s. Therefore, according to my first proposition on the developmental history of critical theory since Adorno's death, the influences of the critical theory that emerged from the Frankfurt University context of the 1960s and 1970s resonated, and still resonate, not only with a loud and self-referential voice, but often with a soft one too, just as Freud says the, quote, voice of the intellect is a soft one, end quote. In metaphorical terms, one might speak of the dispersive effects of the message in a bottle. Many may have tried to uncork and comprehend it, but always while bringing along their own theoretical and socio-political convictions. So the critical spirit of the bottled message could only partially emerge and make an impact, resulting not only in a pluralization of critical theory, but also in a dispersal of mutually inspiring interactions. One example of this will be the political scientist Eileen Fetscher, who attained his professorship in Frankfurt in 1963, who in his work Von Marx zur Sowjetideologie, From Marx to Soviet Ideology, 1957, applied the dialectical method to a movement that itself began with dialectical ambitions, as he interpreted the numerous Marxisms of East and West as a movement to be critiqued not on its external features, but on its immanent self-contradictions, who in his much too often overlooked work, Wer hat Dorn Rüschen wach geküsst? Wer hat Dornröschen wach geküsst? Das Märchen der Buch. Quote, Who Kissed Sleeping Beauty Awake, the fable confounding book, end quote, demonstrated the immense potential for social criticism that lies in the psychoanalytically informed interpretation of fables and myths, and who in his 5-volume Piper's Handbuch der politischen Ideen, I don't fucking know if I'm saying that right, Piper's Handbook of Political Ideas, 1985 to 1993, edited by Herfried Münkler, showcased the emergence of political theories from the political and social conflicts that shaped them. It says Herfried Münkler was born in 1951, is a German political scientist. Herfried Münkler is a professor of political theory at Humboldt University in Berlin. Herfried Münkler is a regular commentator on global affairs in the German language media and author of numerous books on the history of political ideas, on state building, and on the theory of war, such as Machiavelli, published in 1982, Gewalt und Ordnung in 1992, The New Wars, originally published in 2002, and Empires, the Logic of World Domination from Ancient Rome to the United States. In 2009, Münkler was awarded the Leipzig Book Fair Prize in the category Nonfiction for Die Deutschen und ihre Mythen, The Germans and Their Myths. Seeing if there's anything that says much about his... It says, in a section under his political views, it says, during his time as a student, Münkler was a member of the Jusos, youth organization of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. In July 2011, he published an essay in the German weekly news magazine Der Spiegel, calling for more centralization of power in the European Union. So that's who Herfried Münkler is. So let me get back to reread that. The fable his 5-volume Piper's Handbuch der politischen Ideen, Piper's Handbook of Political Ideas, 1985 to 1993, edited by Herfried Münkler, showcased the emergence of political theories from the political and social conflicts that shaped them, thereby revealing the political theories to be social constructs as well as social products of the culture industry in a presentation that was unprecedented in its geniality. Fetcher influenced Münkler, who in today's debates is best known for his analyses of war, in which it must be said that his position is materialistic and not moralizing, but it was particularly through his work on Machiavelli, with its methodology strongly reminiscent of Neumann, that Münkler turned modern political thought on its head by confronting the ontological promise of truth with its empirical/material realities. Fetcher and Münkler have had a considerable influence on today's political science, as to be seen in the ideas of Harald Blum, Matthias Bolender, Marcus Lank, and Carsten Fischer, just to name a few. I don't know. Who is Harald Blum? Just as a political scientist, professor of political theory and history of ideas at Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg. Matthias Bolander. I feel like I've seen that name. It appears that he has a book in the Marx Engels Marxism series. The overview of the book says, bridges the gap between the revolutionary Marx and his scientific critiques of capitalist society, clarifies the need for a modern critique of society to include reflection on Marx's scientific truth claim, problematizes contemporary Marxisms by revealing, quote, time core, end quote, as inherent consequences of Marx's critique. About this book, it says, wait, is it an edited volume? It looks like it might be a edited volume or a collaborative volume. Says this book deals with the central aspect of Marx's critique of society that is usually not examined further, since it is taken as a matter of course, its scientific claim of being true. But what concept of truth underlies his way of reasoning, which attempts to comprehend the social and political circumstances in terms of the possibility of their practical upheaval? In 3 studies for focusing specifically on the development of Marx's scientific critique of capitalist society, his journalistic commentaries on European politics, and his reflections on the organization of revolutionary subjectivity, the authors carve out the imminent relation between the scientifically substantiated claim to truth and the revolutionary perspective in Marx's writings. They argue that Marx does not grasp the world, quote, as it is, end quote, but conceives it as an inverted state which cannot remain what it is, but generates the means by which it can eventually be overcome. This is not something to be taken lightly. Such a concept has theoretical, political, and even violent consequences. Consequences that nevertheless derive neither from a subjective error nor a contamination of an otherwise, quote, pure, end quote, science. By analyzing Marx's concept of truth, the authors also attempt to shed light on a pivotal problematic of any modern critique of society that raises a reasoned claim of being true. So that's why I recognize Matthias Bolander. Marcus Lanck. Marcus Lanck is a German political scientist. He has held the chair for political theory at the Political Science Institute at the University of Augsburg since 2008. It says his areas of work. It says Lanck's academic work focuses on the area of democratic theory, the history of political ideas, here specifically the political thought of republicanism and constitutional theory. In 2000, Lanck was involved in the founding of the Hugo Preuss Society and has been a member of its board as managing director. Marcus Lanck is also a member of the German Society for the Study of Political Thought and the German Association for Political Science, where he is also a board member of the, quote, Political Theory and History of Ideas section. Since 2010, Lanck has been publishing the newly founded Journal for Political Theory together with Gary S. Schall and Andre Broch. He's a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Weimar Republic Association for the House of the Weimar Republic. And Carsten Fischer. Carsten Fischer is a political scientist. Yeah, I'm not really finding too much on him. Anyway, in this regard, the political scientist Ingeborg Maus can be seen as equally influenced and influential, having worked and taught in Frankfurt in the 1970s, becoming an acting professor in 1980 and a permanent one in Frankfurt in 1992, and for a time doing project work under Habermas, who was a major proponent of a materialistic turn in legal theory as well. In her role as a, quote, enlightener of democracy theory, end quote, a turn toward the subject person in legal thought. Inspired by Neumann, Maus has argued against indeterminacy in law as a politically manipulable openness to interpretation, and especially against general clauses, thereby emphasizing the indisputability of statute law while combining this with the radical demand for a real and not just hypothetical legitimation by the people. From this basic demand for radical popular sovereignty, Maus argues that, in regard to the state's monopoly on the use of force and its function in establishing an executively oriented administrative order, the true essence of the idea of sovereignty, being the commitment to freedom in the form of popular sovereignty, is being neglected, against which she posits the principle of transferring legislative powers as widely as possible to the social foundation of the people. Current political and legal theorists who concur with the ideas of Maus include Sonja Buckel, just as they're political scientists. I can't really find anything on their work. Hauke Blankhorst. Wait, hold on. Oh no! This person has a book in the historical materialism book series. It's called Subjectivation and Cohesion. I have a friend who read this, actually. Towards the Reconstruction of a Materialist Theory of Law. The description says, on the basis of a reconstruction of legal theory in the tradition of Marx, a current that has been more or less silenced since the end of the 1970s, subjectivation and cohesion develops a critical counterpole to the theories of law that predominate in social theory today. To this end, the works of Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, Yevgeny Pashukanis, Oscar Necht, Isaac D. Balbus, the so-called State Derivation School, Antonio Gramsci, Nikos Palancis, and Michel Foucault are first analyzed for their strengths and weaknesses, and then combined to form a new construction, a materialist legal theory that is up to date and can avoid the shortcomings of existing theories, above all their disregard for gender relations and the reductive consequences of functionalist, economic, or politicist approaches to law. This book was originally published in German as Subjektivierung und Kohäsion zur Rekonstruktion einer materialistischen Theorie des Rechts. So, okay. Oh, they have somebody. Okay. Hauke Blankhorst. Who's Hauke Blankhorst? Hauke Blankhorst, born in 1945, is a German political sociologist, professor of sociology and head of the Institute for Sociology at the University of Flensburg, Germany. He specializes in European constitutionalism, political theory, and European affairs. His books include Solidarity from Civic Friendship to a Global Legal Community, and Adorno and Critical Theory. Looks like he's written books also. He wrote the book in the one series, Critical Theory of Legal Revolutions, which is published in one of the series on critical theory. So, what's this have to say? His book is titled Critical Theory of Legal Revolutions. This unique work analyzes the crisis in modern society, building on the ideas of the Frankfurt School thinkers, emphasizing social evolution and learning processes. It argues that crisis is mediated by social class conflicts and collective learning, the result of which are embodied in constitutional and public law. First, the work outlines a new categorical framework of critical theory in which it is conceived as a theory of crisis. It shows that the Marxist focus on economy and on class struggle is too narrow to deal with the range of social conflicts within modern society, and posits that a crisis of legitimization is at the core of all crises. It then discusses the dialectic of revolutionary and evolutionary developmental processes of modern society and its legal system. This volume in the Critical Theory and Contemporary Society by a leading scholar in the field provides a new approach to critical theory that will appeal to anyone studying political sociology, political theory, and law. So that's Hauke Bronkhorst. And the next person is Peter Niesen. Not really seeing anything from him. There's a thing that talks about it's an about me from his one of his profiles online. My research on democratic theory and international political focuses on democratic theory and international political theory. I approach normative, especially institutional questions in a mindset that combines elements from critical theory and neo-Kantian political thought. A current research project examines whether the notion of constituent power can be usefully employed for polities and protest movement beyond the state. Besides my work in contemporary political theory, I have an interest in the political philosophy of the late and post-Enlightenment, especially Kant, Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. So that's Peter Niesen. Back to the text. So that the sentence that those people were in with current political and legal theorists who concur with the ideas of Mauss include Sonia Buckel, Hauke Bronkhorst, and Peter Niesen. Two more figures influenced by the climate of social criticism in the 1960s and 70s Frankfurt and intellectually connected to critical theory through the play of interactions are the psychologist Alfred Lorenzer and sociologist Ulrich Uvermann. I've already looked them up. The hermeneutics conceptions presented by Lorenzer and Uvermann, who attained their professorships in Frankfurt in 74 and 75 respectively, are often discussed in terms of their methodological contrasts, which arise from very real differences between, quote, in-depth hermeneutics, end quote, and, quote, objective hermeneutics, end quote. But what should not be overlooked is that both methodological approaches share a deep connection to the subject and not wanting inflict upon it the violence of explanation. Instead, they try to use their different methodologies to get the subject to speak for itself in order to discern the subject's trajectories and resistances both within and against bourgeois society, so that their meaning and connotations are revealed and their understanding is made possible. Therefore, both in-depth hermeneutics and objective hermeneutics offer methodological strategies for extrapolating, through the analysis of subjective articulations, both the particular within these articulations and the general, thus further developing hermeneutics as a tool for social criticism while negating its potential for exegetical closure, as it continues its transformation from a tool for Christian domination into a medium for the skeptical critique of dominance. With these approaches, which are always remain methodologically vigilant of the fallibility of the subject, not only in terms of what is being interpreted, but especially in terms of the person interpreting. Lorenzo and Uverman have developed two more possible ways of making social theory generalizations, thereby complementing the purely ideology critical method, but without falling victim to the false appearance of mathematical quantification. Similar to the multitude of differences in detail between in-depth hermeneutics and objective hermeneutics, there are now a multitude of people who are indebted to the ideas of Lorenzo and Uverman today, including Hans-Dieter Koenig, Helmut Dahmer, and Jo Reichertz. Let's see. Hans-Dieter Koenig. He's a psychoanalyst. Don't really see anything for him. It says Hans-Dieter Koenig is a master of philosophy, professor, Dr. Phil, habilitation, master of philosophy, psychological psychotherapist, works as a psychoanalyst, training analyst, and supervisor in his own practice in Dortmund, and teaches sociology and social psychology at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. It says relation to deep hermeneutics. Habilitation with Alfred Lorenzer in an in-depth hermeneutic study of the Western productions in Marlboro advertising and in Ronald Reagan's political propaganda. Essays on the methodology and method of deep hermeneutics, on the relationship between critical theory and deep hermeneutics, and on the application of deep hermeneutics in social psychology and political psychology, in pedagogy, education after Auschwitz, in literature, in feature films and documentaries. His two main books are, his most recent one is called Affects. These are all in German, so I'm sure I don't think they're translated into English. 2008, he published a book called George W. Bush and the Fanatical War on Terrorism, a psychoanalytic study of authoritarianism in America. And 2006, Right-Wing Extremism in Television Documentaries, Psychoanalytic Reconstruction of Their Mode of Action. So that's who Hans-Dieter Koenig is. Helmut Dahmer. Helmut Dahmer looks like he might be a interesting. Helmut Dahmer is a sociologist and professor emeritus of the University in Darmstadt, now living in Vienna. He is the chief editor of the works of Leon Trotsky in Germany. And that description is from International Viewpoint website. He has an article titled Luxemburg and Trotsky on Russian Revolution. Sounds like an interesting figure. Dahmer was senior editor and co-editor of the psychoanalytic monthly Psyche since 1982. After its editor, Alexander Misterlich, died in 1982, the editors of Psycho drew the attention of their readers, quote, to the adaptation policy and conformity ideology of the, quote, Aryan, end quote, board of the DPG that was practiced in the first years of the, quote, Third Reich, end quote, and has now been half forgotten, end quote. The article Psychoanalysis and Weltschauung, or Worldview, by the psychoanalyst Karl Müller-Braunschweig in a Nazi magazine played a key role. Dahmer had already discovered this explosive article as a reprint around 1970 during his studies on Wilhelm Reich in his Journal of Political Psychology and Sexual Economics, but did not expose it. Now he reprinted it in the Psyche. In the ensuing controversy, as he reports, he was met with the, quote, sheer hatred of those psychoanalysts whose identity had merged with this murky past of German psychoanalysis, end quote. As a result of these quarrels, Dahmer ultimately lost his position as senior editor of Psycho. Dahmer edited Leon Trotsky's writings on Germany in 2 volumes in 1971 as the Spiritus Rector of a German-language annotated edition of Trotsky's writings, 8 volumes of which have been published to date. As a student in the 1960s, Dahmer was already guided by Trotsky's political ideas. Quote, I kept my distance from the, quote, Maoist, end quote, the sympathizers of the Chinese, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, as well as from the circles from which the RAF later emerged, end quote. He remembered in 2010, quote, I was and am convinced that neither mass terror nor, quote, individual, end quote, terror can break open the iron shell of capitalism. Trotsky and Trotskyism represent an unresolved and undiscredited alternative to capitalism. Very interesting. I hope this isn't too boring for people to hear me read these descriptions of people. See, Jo Reichertz. Jo Reichertz, born in 1949, the sociologist, was professor of communication studies at the University of Duisburg Essen from 1993 to early 2015. Since April 2015, Jo Reichertz has been a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities in Essen and a member of the board, where he leads the project area Cultures of Communication. Don't really see anything about him. Alright, so back to the text. The sentence that I was last reading says, similar to the multitude of differences in detail between in-depth hermeneutics and objective hermeneutics, there are now a multitude of people who are indebted to the ideas of Lorenzer and or Uwermann even today, including Hans-Dieter Koenig, Helmut Dahmer, and Jo Reichertz, to name just a few. The history of social criticism in Frankfurt in the 1960s and 70s is not only the history of the IFS and the AFE Tower, but also that of the Sigmund Freud Institute. Sigmund Freud Institute. The Sigmund Freud Institute is a research institute for psychoanalysis located in Frankfurt, Germany. It was established in 1960 as an institute and training center for psychoanalysis and psychosomatic medicine. Renamed in 1964, it is now called after Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Since 1995, the institution has been dedicated entirely to research. So that's what the Sigmund Freud Institute is. This milieu is best represented by Alexander Misterlich, who became the Institute's first director in 1960 and a professor at Frankfurt University in 1966. He's a key figure for the many thinkers who strove and still strive for a continued deepening of psychoanalysis and critical theory. In his book, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, The Inability to Mourn, co-written by Margareta Misterlich, Mitscherlich, Alexander Mitscherlich, engaged quite deeply with critical theory ideas in examining the empirical reality of the West German Republic, highlighting how the subjects now suffering from the dictates of bourgeois socialization were the same ones who had previously enabled and executed wartime barbarism. With a narcissistic self-pity, this generation of perpetrators reimagined itself after 1945 as a childlike victim, projecting responsibility for its own aggression and its own disappointment upon the figure of Hitler, thereby derealizing the Nazi past. This illustrates the complicated relationship between subject orientation and society orientation. Because the subject, to whom both critical theory and psychoanalysis are beholden, is often itself the problem in barbaric socialization, thus only hypothetically representing a potential agent for emancipation, and in this course, constellation is thereby eliminated as a potential addressee for the message in a bottle. Mitscherlich, like Klaus Horn, the fuck is Klaus Horn? It just says that he's a German social psychologist and psychoanalyst. Mitscherlich, like Klaus Horn, mark out the line of connection between critical theory and psychoanalysis with a point of departure in the latter, which would become significant for the subsequent development of differentiations in critical theory during the 1980s and 1990s, as the reciprocal inspiration emanating from these Frankfurt impulses continued to resonate. However, at the dawn of the 21st century, the onward paths of a critical theory informed by psychoanalysis seem increasingly likely to fade away. At this juncture, it should be said that in terms of, quote, genetic, end quote, perspective on the development of critical theory, the pursuit of an outlook that is less dogmatic and thereby less oriented toward personal relationships of, quote, inheritance, end quote, could help in revealing the broader plurality of socially critical approaches that have incorporated influences from critical theory, while also sending back influences in return. Therefore, it would perhaps be more advantageous to the project of critical theory at the dawn of the 21st century if we could also recognize the coherences that exist within the dissonances. The path toward this goal involves two detours, one towards Starnberg near Munich and the other towards Hanover, encompassing the further development of critical theory through the ideas, inspirations, and personal assistance provided by Jürgen Habermas and Oscar Necht. New section, Roads out of Frankfurt, Starnberg and Hanover. Alex Demirovich has pointed out that critical theory, at critical theory's core, has always included consideration of the ways material and economic relationships are reproduced, even if this is not always immediately apparent in its writings. In fact, one of the main criticisms exercised against Habermas is that in ignoring the material core of bourgeois socialization, one falls victim to the ideological appearance of the discursively free individual. A historically decisive factor here revolves around a paradox that is inherent in the Frankfurt situation itself. As a highly contested ideal of social criticism research, one that was unparalleled in the West Germany of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Berlin was closer to the student movement, while Marburg was closer to the communist Marxist politics. / Marx. I think the Marburg School, I'm not exactly sure if Leo Kofler was affiliated with the Marburg School, but it was definitely under the influence of Wolfgang Abendroth. I think that's anything. Or Abendroth, I'm not exactly sure. Is it Arben or Aben? I think it might be Abendroth. I'm not sure. But there's a book by the Historical Materialism book series called The Marburg School. Frankfurt's social criticism debate revolved around hard-fought intellectual advances in which critical and theoretical reflection was conducted intensively, pugnaciously, and in great detail, while also necessarily producing two discrepancies. Firstly, with this El Dorado of critical theory, there was a creeping loss of self-awareness in terms of its own objective role within West Germany's intellectual ecology, and in terms of a relative marginalization of competing approaches, and thus a loss of awareness concerning inside versus outside within its own debates. Secondly, this led to a minimizing and obscuring of an equally necessary reflection upon one's own weaknesses, not only through, quote, internally critical dialogues, end quote, i.e. between different followers of critical theory, but also through scholarly and political dialogues with the conformist positivist majority of West German academia. The departure of Habermas in 1971 from Frankfurt to the Max Planck Institute for the Study of the Scientific Technical World in Starnberg, which has often been depicted as a sidetrack, was an entirely understandable reaction to this problem. Habermas sought to confront competing and somewhat hegemonic scholarly paradigms such as systems theory, thus attempting to defend and hone his own positions through a concrete engagement with competing creeds in the social sciences and humanities, which necessarily resulted in a tempering of his own social criticism in return. The ambivalence of critical theory, of never belonging and yet never really being excluded either, was thereby neutralized through a necessarily one-sided attempt at reconciliation, but at the same time, there also existed an opportunity for critical theory to avoid degenerating into simple self-reassurance, meaning as a critical theorist who is similar to a subject who suffers from not being able to create a right life amidst the wrongs, but who nonetheless tries to resolve this ultimately unresolvable contradiction. Habermas's goal of creating, quote, reasonable and/or fair results, end quote, through a procedure of, quote, negotiations as well as discourses on self-understanding and justice, end quote, thus to create a, quote, decentered society, end quote, within a, quote, self-organizing legal community, end quote, offers hope to the subject, without, however, assuming that the subject's disappointment is a necessary consequence of its negative socialization. Thus, in terms of reconstructing the history of critical theory, Habermas's migration to Starnberg, which also incorporated influences from critical theorists like Helmut Dubil and Salah Ben Habib. I'm going to assume you know who Salah Ben Habib is. And back to Frankfurt was not an attempt, as also confirmed by the evolution of Habermas's writings, to counteract the subject's focus seen in the social criticism developed through structural analysis in Frankfurt in the 1960s and 70s. Whereby in this understanding of the subject, it was not about a psychoanalytical understanding of suffering or a critique of suffering from a structural analysis perspective, but rather an understanding of subjectivity that believes in neutralizing suffering only through the deliberations of communicative action. If one can set aside all the interpersonal squabbles seen in the Frankfurt milieu in the 1960s and 1970s, which also contributed to the mutual hardening of antipathies, of course, an easy thing to ask if one was not personally involved in these disputes, then my second proposition on the historical development of critical theory since Adorno's death potentially acquired additional persuasiveness. Namely, that the latter disputes of the 1980s largely originated from the conflicting inclinations of critical theory toward either a subject orientation or a society orientation, whereby Habermas demonstrates a turn towards the subject orientation in his inclination toward a critical theory that lacks a fundamental critique of the economic basis of bourgeois society, with its focus on determining the, quote, conditions under which human interaction would be free from domination, end quote, as a consequence of this differentiation process, a focus through which all his theoretical works on communication and deliberation can be understood, and which is already hinted at in the intellectual and self-reflexive debates at the Starnberg Max Planck Institute. Starnberg represented an ultimately failed attempt, not least due to the social science realignments of the Max Planck Society, to establish the theoretically immanent basis of critical theory. In contrast, Hanover represented a very different attempt at bolstering the truth of critical theory, seeking its basis not in theory but in society itself. Hanover was impulsive, radical, and interventional. In 1970, Oscar Knecht, after a student campaign failed to achieve his appointment as director of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, and Knecht then accepted an invitation to Hanover, met the social psychologist Peter Bruckner in Hanover, where they both went on to shape a climate of social criticism, both at the university and far beyond it, that would resonate for many years. Did I already look up Peter Bruckner? Let me see. I'm not seeing anything. Oh, it looks like there's something from TIB Hanover. Peter Bruckner was a German critical social psychologist who lectured at Hanover University from 1967 to 1982. Apart from its significance for science and research, Bruckner's work adds important insight into the history of the Federal Republic of Germany, which he analyzed and commented from the perspective of a social psychologist. All the works published by Peter Bruckner can be found in the TIB Social Sciences collection. The Peter Bruckner archives comprises his bequest, including unpublished manuscripts, typescripts, fragments, notes, speeches, radio broadcasts, and other documents from the period 1953 to 1982. The archives document Peter Bruckner as a person as well as his scientific work. The archives also shed light on the history of the institution and science of psychology in Hanover. They also contain press and radio source material on the political climate in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1970s and early 1980s. So, that's who Peter Bruckner is. So it said, in 1970, Oscar Knecht, after a student campaign failed to achieve his appointment as director of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, he then accepted an invitation to Hanover, met the social psychologist Peter Bruckner in Hanover, where Bruckner and Knecht both went on to shape a climate of social criticism, both at the university and far beyond the university, that would resonate for many years. Knecht was intensively involved with politics, first with the Social Democratic Party, then the Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund, or Socialist German Student League. Knecht was very active in trade unionist adult education, formulating in his book Soziologische Fantasie und exemplarisches Lernen, sociological imagination and learning by example, published in 1968. The then trailblazing idea that learning by example should be prioritized over the pure rote learning of facts. He became a co-founder and academic advisor of Hanover's Goethe School, known for its alternative pedagogy. Goethe School. Looks like Chris O'Kane of put something up about this. This is from February of this year. Chris O'Kane put on X, in pursuit of, quote, liberated learning, end quote, the pupils learn by example and by undertaking projects. At the Goethe School, there are no school bells and no different subjects, just 4 areas of inquiry: nature, languages, society, and aesthetics. So that's the Goethe. I don't know. That's the most I can find for the Goethe School. the Goethe School, known for its alternative pedagogy, and in his analysis of labor/production relationships under capitalism, Knecht developed new perspectives for the labor movement that would take its concrete life experiences as the bottom-up basis for social theory. Until the physical winding down of the Psychological Institute and the de facto winding down of critical theory in the mid-2000s, Hanover was, alongside Frankfurt, a central site for crystallizing critical theory, and even though larger communal projects ended in failure, many important critical theorists, including Gerd Scheffer, Joachim Perls, Jürgen Seifert, Peter Bulthaupt, Regina Becker-Schmidt, Gudrun, Alexei Knapp, Rolf Pohl, Alfred Kovoza, and Detlef Clausen continued pursuing both a subject orientation in integrating psychoanalytical and feminist approaches into critical theory analyses, and a society orientation in conducting structural analyses of law, as well as historically inspired critiques of National Socialism and post-Nazism. So I'm going to look up all these people now. So let's see. Gerd Scheffer. Gerd Scheffer, Social Theory. It looks like he has a piece by piece in Science and Society titled Friedrich Engels, Builder of a Closed System, ? So that's all I see from him. Joachim Perls. Joachim Perls, it says, is a political scientist. Joachim Perls is a German political scientist born in 1942. It says his areas of work are democratic constitutional theory, the power structure of state socialism, coming to terms with the Nazi past, the aftermath of the Nazi system in the Federal Republic of Germany, the punishment of state crimes, and the political implications of theology. Joachim Perls is, among other things, co-founder and editor of the magazine Critical Justice, chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Fritz Bauer Institute, and member of the International Expert Commission for the Expansion of the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, as well as deputy director of the Institute for Research on Federalism. He was awarded the Fritz Bauer Prize of the Humanist Union. It looks like he has a number of books. It says Democracy and Social Emancipation, Contributions to the Constitutional Theory of Civil Society and Socialism, The Legal Legacy of the Third Reich, Damage to the Democratic Legal System, Right-wing Radicalism, a Fringe Phenomenon, Critical Analyses, Disposal of Nazi Rule, Conflict Lines in Dealing with the Hitler Regime, Liberation from Social Immaturity, Contributions to the History and Theory of the Labor Movement. Quote, he cast down the mighty from their thrones and exalts the lowly, end quote. Contributions to Theology. National Socialism as a Contemporary Problem. As editor, Conscience Before Reason of State, selected writings of Martin Niemöller, and a book titled Views and Life Stages of Critical Conscience. Conversations recorded, edited, and edited by Martin Ahrens. So that's who that is. That's who Joachim Perls is. He looks like the dude, God, no, in this one picture, no, he doesn't really look like him. In this one picture, he looks like the dude from Creep Show, the Stephen King, George A. Romero movie, who, the racist old guy lives in the block tower or like the apartment at the top of the skyscraper, and it's infested with bugs, and the bugs eat them. You know. Yeah, I'm not really saying anything for Jürgen Seifert. Peter Bulthaup. Peter Bulthaup was a German philosopher and chemist. Bulthaup received his doctorate in physical chemistry under Hermann Hartmann at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main in 1968 and was a student of Adorno and Horkheimer. In 1973, he became a professor of didactics of natural sciences at TH Darmstadt. Since 1975, he has held a chair in philosophy at the University of Hanover with a focus on German idealism, natural philosophy, and criticism of political economy, also scientific advisory board for the Hanover Institute of Social Sciences. His publications include on the social function of the natural sciences, Perusia, materials for Benjamin's theses on the concept of history, contributions and interpretations, edited by Peter Bulthaup, Emergency and Alotria, reflections on the relationship between reflection and art, of freedom in the economic sense, on some difficulties in determining the promotion of technical progress from economic constraints, in The Automatic Subject in Marx, Studies on Capital, The Law of Liberation and Other Texts, ... If God Himself Died, Hegel's Criticism of Religion, Expediency, Absolute Purpose, Concept, Criticism of the Hegelian Deduction of the Concept. Those are his pieces. Regina Becker-Schmidt. Now, this is someone whose name I've come across before in knowing about recent German research on Marx. Regina Becker-Schmidt is an emeritus professor at the Institute of Sociology and Social Psychology at the Leibniz University of Hanover. Her research focuses on the corporate and subject theory, critical theory, psychoanalytically oriented social psychology, and gender studies. Regina Becker-Schmidt is considered a seminal figure in feminist critical theory. Starting in 1957, Becker-Schmidt studied... sorry, I don't want to read all this. That's boring. In particular, Becker-Schmidt influenced the development of feminist critical theory, especially in the German-speaking countries. Her approach is associated with the so-called Hanoverian approach in feminist-oriented sociology and has had decisive influence on the approach. Becker-Schmidt critiqued the positions of critical theory, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, with regard to the ambivalent attitude to the complex of gender relations and how the critical theorists have been oblivious to feminism. She questioned how gender relations could be made an integral part of critical theory. Muharrem Askaz situates Regina Becker-Schmidt in the second generation of the Frankfurt School. She was a student of Adorno's. She distinguishes herself from other feminist critical theorists in her empirical orientation, following Max Horkheimer, who argued that, quote, larger philosophical questions, end quote, guide empirical research, and empirical research in turn guide larger philosophical questions. Her research on female factory workers situates itself in this relation. Becker-Schmidt conducted empirical research on female factory workers, developing her own social theory based on her findings. Her project was titled Problems of Mothers Who Are Wage Laborers and consists of interviews with 60 factory workers, half who were still working and half who had withdrawn from factory work. Her research shed light on the, quote, double burden, end quote, faced by women factory workers, the responsibility for domestic work combined with responsibility for contributing to the income of the family. She developed the concept of double socialization of women. Through wage labor and domestic work, the two spheres come from two different social realms with different logics and are both separated and connected. Regina Becker-Schmidt's research focused on both the objective demands of work and the subjective realities of the worker. In each setting, time itself functions differently. In the factory, women must not lose time, while when taking care of children, women must forget about time, other than in remembering to get housework done before work the next day. The two realms are recombined through relationships assumed to be heterosexual in the efforts of women to, quote, have both career and, quote, have both, end quote, career and family life. Very interesting. I think she's at Roto Marx too, but I'm not sure. Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, that's Regina Becker-Schmidt. Gudrun Alexei Knapp. Definitely recognize that name. Gudrun Alexei Knapp, who lived from 1944 to still alive, is a German social scientist and professor emerita of the Psychological Institute of the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz University of Hanover. Oh, there we are. Wikipedia. And the internet's out. Motherfucker. One second. I'm trying to... Calm the fuck on, man. Well, guess you can't figure out who the rest of these people, who Rolf Pohl, Alfred Krovoza, and Detlef Clausen are. But I have a piece by Detlef Clausen, if that's any consolation to you. Motherfucker. Anyway, therefore, both Habermas and Knecht accomplished in their considerations a turn to the subject, which was also reflected in their involvements with the student movement, a turn that provoked in Adorno initially at least irritation, and then ultimately rejection due to his ongoing critique of the focus on the real-world subjects of bourgeois socialization. However, the paths of Habermas and Knecht differed not only in terms of geography. While Habermas' turn to the subject was primarily focused on the intellectual aspects that facilitate emancipation, Knecht's focus is on the material foundations of this goal, and there's a second important difference. In Sternberg, Habermas oriented himself toward the academic system as a discursive site, as described earlier, while in Hanover the emphasis was on critical theories, quote, claims to truth beyond academia, end quote. So the academic system was not of central importance. This is why the society orientation attained greater relevance in Hanover than in Starnberg. New section, Grand Highway and ... Habermas returned to Frankfurt in 1983, repeatedly emphasizing that he did not want to be involved in developing a particular, quote, school, and also that he himself could not be unambiguously labeled a, quote, critical theorist, end quote, not least to his own biographical evolution. Nonetheless, it is still Habermas's name that is primarily associated with the labels, quote, Frankfurt School and, quote, critical theory in the public consciousness today, also because the Hanover milieu repeated the same mistakes seen in Frankfurt in the 1960s and 1970s, as conceded self-critically by social scientists who had been academically socialized in Hanover in the 1990s, from which one could have at least learned that university-based critical theory, as had been actively pursued in Hanover, could have been saved from winding down only through long-term policies of academic development. Regardless of any public proclamations, Habermas had in fact developed specific schools of thought in many regards, and if one looks in retrospect at the Frankfurt of the 1980s and its eventual development, one sees the paths trodden by and subsequent to Habermas have now been expanded into a grand highway, one strongly connected to the names of Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, and the University of Frankfurt's Cluster of Excellence, the formation of normative orders. The formation of normative orders, end quote. It's in capitals, so let's see if it yields something in a search on the internet. It's something. There's a link to something that says the formation of normative orders. That's the Rhein-Main Universitäten website, or Universitäten. I don't know. Freedom, and it says on the webpage, freedom and justice, tolerance and participation. The researchers in the cluster of excellence, quote, the formation of normative orders, end quote, are reflecting on such rights and principles in social life. How are political, legal, religious, or economic orders established? How do they change? How do structures of power crystallize in such processes of social dynamics? How are power and life chances distributed on national and transnational levels? The topic is of high social relevance. We need to reflect on a world the orders of which are defended with power and yet are still fragile. The research of the cluster focuses on current social conflicts about a fair order of society in times of globalization as well as its long prehistory. It examines the normative ideas that play a role in such processes and conflicts, as well as how they can be criticized or justified. Above all, the fundamentals of politics and law are highlighted in the humanities and social sciences. Such questions are complex, and it is for this reason that the cluster of excellence, quote, the formation of normative orders, end quote, at Goethe University in Frankfurt works on an interdisciplinary basis, from philosophy, history, political science, and law, to ethnology, economics, sociology, and theology. The cluster of excellence, quote, the formation of normative orders, end quote, is a research network involved in the following partner institutions: Frobenius Institute, Frankfurt am Main; Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, Frankfurt am Main; Institute for Social Research, Frankfurt am Main; Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, Heidelberg; Max Planck Institute for European Legal History, Frankfurt am Main; Point Sud, Center for Research on Local Knowledge, Bamako, Mali; and Technische Universität Darmstadt. So, that's what the formation of normative orders is. It goes on to say, it is Honneth who must first be considered as a key figure, not only, this is back to the text, it is Hannett who must first be considered as a key figure, not only intellectually but also institutionally, in his role as director of the Institute for Social Research. Hannett, who completed his habilitation in Frankfurt in 1990, and after professorships in Constance and Berlin became professor in Frankfurt in 1996, also becoming the director of the Institute for Social Research in 2001. Following Habermas in emphasizing that the main hope was no longer oriented toward the, quote, sphere of labor, end quote, as this drew upon, quote, historical metaphysical speculations, end quote. Instead, the, quote, conceptualization of emancipatory theory, end quote, needed to be reoriented toward the, quote, idea of communicative action, end quote. At the same time, after the Institute for Social Research had already spent a good 3 decades examining industrial sociological questions, Hannett now sees its present task as, quote, once again bringing together, end quote, philosophy and social research, putting the focus on, quote, paradoxes of capitalist modernization, end quote, in order to develop a, quote, new model of social theory, end quote, which has resulted in the interdisciplinary composition of today's International Institute for Social Research roster, currently including names like Klaus Günther, seems to have wrote a book on Habermas. Kai Olaf Maywald. Some of Maywald's books include Microsociology, a Toolkit for Interaction Analysis, Maywald, Microsociology, an Introduction, Maywald, Professionalization in the Modern Professional System, the Example of Family Mediation. He wrote a piece with Regina Guildmaster, Claudia Scheid, and Elizabeth Seifert Konau, Gender Differentiation in the Horizon of Equality, Exemplary Analyses of Professional Careers and Professional Practice in Family Law, and Kai Olaf Maywald, The Creation of Law, an exemplary study of the professionalization history of jurisprudence using the example of Prussia at the end of the 18th century. The next person is Sighard Neckel. Not really seeing anything. It just says Sighard Neckel is professor of sociology at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Hamburg and spokesperson of the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies, quote, Futures of Sustainability, end quote. Oh. Wikipedia. Sighard Neckel. Just as a bunch of career stuff. Juliana Rebentisch. That's an attractive woman. Juliana Robentisch is a German philosopher and art historian whose research focuses on the history and politics of aesthetics. Robentisch is the author of 3 books: Aesthetics of Art Installation, Sternberg, 2003, The Art of Freedom on the Dialectics of Democratic Existence, and Tieren der Gegenwartskunst, and has edited numerous art volumes on aesthetics, ethics, political philosophy in both German and English. Josef Chitry, in the academic journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, called Aesthetics of Installation art a, quote, formidable work, end quote. In 2017, she received the Lessing Prize from the city of Hamburg, an award given to major German cultural figures who have a connection to the city. She is the first woman to be awarded the Lessing Prize since it was given to Hannah Arendt in 1959. So, Ferdinand Salluti. It says Ferdinand Salluti. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Is a German sociologist who deals with the sociology of violence and crime, socialization, family and youth sociology, social inequality and exclusion, ethnic conflicts, and the sociology of religion. He's had some writings: Violent Careers, Young People in the Cycle of Violence and Disregard, Adventure Field Research, Sociologists Tell, In Clannishness, Negative Classifications and Ethnic Conflicts, Masks of Evil, special issue of the magazine Psychosocial, The Dispute Over Child Welfare, Narratives of Violence, Interdisciplinary Analyses, Global Studies of Childhood, Covert Resistance in Democratic Societies. Those are kind of the things he's interested in. And Stefan Vosswinkel. I don't know, I'm not really seeing anything that looks promising. Okay. So, which has resulted in a disciplinary back to the text, which has resulted in the interdisciplinary composition of today's IFS roster, currently including names like Klaus Günther, Kai Olaf Maywald, Zikard Neckel, Juliana Rebentisch, Ferdinand Satterluti, and Stefan Vosswinkel, and is also reflected in the self-understanding proclaimed of the Institute for Social Research. Quote, the goal of today's institutional work is to bring together empirical and theoretical research projects under an overarching framework program, quote, paradoxes of capitalist modernization, end quote, thereby contributing to a critical understanding of structural changes in society. By situating his own research as well as the work of the Institute for Social Research in this way, Hannett, on the one hand, aligns himself with Habermas and his subject orientation, but on the other hand decisively modifies this by striving toward a reactualization of critical theory's society orientation. Unlike Habermas, whose political philosophy revolves around the idea of communicative action, Hannett grounds his political philosophy on the concept of recognition, and thus of freedom, which he establishes in social theory terms. Hannett thereby refers back to the, quote, constituent spheres of our society, end quote, which he understands as, quote, institutional embodiments of particular values whose imminent claims toward realization can serve as indicators of each sphere's specific principles of fairness, end quote. Modern society itself can thus be understood as the manifestation of particular values in its various structures. For Hannett, freedom is the, quote, autonomy of the individual, end quote. And the, quote, individual freedom, end quote, is the, quote, normative foundation of all conceptions of fairness, end quote, to which also belongs the right of, quote, withdrawal from the network of communicative action, end quote, since the public arena is not some kind of, quote, supreme court, end quote. In this conception by Hannett, two aspects are particularly worth noting. First, Hannett boldly tackles the problem of trying to bring the subject orientation back together with the society orientation, thereby seeing society's structures in a Hegelian-influenced analysis as sites for realizing subjective principles. The second, he highlights a radical freedom of the subject, including the communicative arena itself. In this way, he conceptually addresses two fundamental problems in the ideas of Habermas, problems often considered to be a turning away from the goals of critical theory, thereby separating the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, of Frankfurt, from the theory of communicative action, by granting to the subject precisely the right that under Habermas can only be seen as a freedom to communicate, but not a freedom from communication. Following this intellectual turn, which is seen within the Frankfurt milieu itself as much less of a break with Habermas than it objectively is, Rainer Forst then formulated the key idea that mediates between subject orientation and society orientation, which ultimately let the Frankfurt scene grow into a spacious highway, not only due to the numerous critical theory positions that have constantly emerged there, as they have in the entire time since Adorno, but also because in 2007 a, quote, cluster of excellence, end quote, was successfully established in Frankfurt. The, quote, formation of normative orders, end quote, providing social criticism research with material resources that had never existed before. The key social criticism concept developed by Forst is the idea of justification. In his analysis, Forst connects subject orientation to society orientation when he links justification for political rule back to the question of legitimation, while also emphasizing that justification is concretely shaped by real historical actors who challenge the justifications that underpin the, quote, normative order to which they are subjugated, end quote. Even if utopian Habermasian hopes might still shine forth here, such as when Forst similarly concerns himself with, quote, justified, non-arbitrary, and non-dominating rule, end quote, raising for him the question of how to bring the justification of norms into discursive practice. Forst sees the fundamental root not in discourse, but in, quote, social conflict, end quote, and thus in society's material foundations, not society's theoretical foundations. For Forst, the subjugated are the subjects within this justification process, whereby the individual is, quote, in equal measures both irreplaceable and one among many, end quote. So that Forst picks up on the ambivalent conception of the subject as seen in the critical theory of Adorno and Horkheimer, extends the ideas of Hannett, and arrives at an understanding of the socialized subject whose subject orientation, which is not only discursive, once again allows for the consideration of a generalized social theory model, and one that does not remain stuck in the descriptive phase. This is also demonstrated by Forst's idea that although power may be of a discursive nature, the struggle for power should be understood as a, quote, struggle for the possibility of structuring or even ruling the justification potentials of others, end quote. This approach is being intensively pursued at the Cluster of Excellence, quote, the formation of normative orders, end quote, led by Rainer Forst and Klaus Gunther, with further members including names like Christopher Daza. It says Christopher Dawes is professor of international organization at the Goethe University of Frankfurt and director of the Department of International Organizations and International Law at the Peace Research Institute of Frankfurt. His main book seems to be a thing called Small Wars, Big Impact, How Unconventional Warfare is Changing International Politics. It seems like he's edited a couple volumes. Rule in International Politics, with some other people. Rule and Resistance Beyond the Nation State, Contest, Escalation, Exit. Domination in International Relations. International Risk Policy, Dealing with New Dangers in International Relations. And with other people, regionalization of security policy, tendencies in international relations after the East-West conflict. The next person is Nicola Deitelhoff. It seems like her works are Persuasion in Politics, Basic Principles of a Discourse Theory of International Governance, Statehood in Transition, What Remains of the State, Democracy, Law, and Constitution in the Global Age, Corporate Security Responsibility, Corporate Governance, Contributions to Peace and Security in Zones of Conflict, Beyond Taboos, The Privatization of the Military, Parallel Universes or Fusion of Horizons, Justification Narratives in Political Negotiation Processes, A Lot of Noise About Nothing, Is Fair Enough, Legitimization of International Governance Through Deliberative Procedures, Business and Human Rights, How Corporate Norm Violators Become Norm Entrepreneurs, Beyond Soft Balancing, Small States and Coalition Building in the ICC and Climate Negotiations, Times of Rule, International Political Theory as a Social Theory of International Relations, and Textbook of International Relation, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the International Relations Galaxy. So that's Nicola Deitelhoff. Nikita Dawan, Wikipedia. Nikita Dawan is an Indian political scientist. Since 2021, she has been professor of political theory and the history of ideas at TU Dresden. Dawan's research and interest focus on global justice, human rights, democracy, and decolonization. A central focus of her research and teaching is on the historical, social, economic, socio-political, and cultural connections between Europe and the post-colonial world. Nikita Dawan's work analyzes the ambivalent legacy of the European Enlightenment for the post-colonial world and seeks to pursue an alternative post-colonial queer feminist intellectual history of key concepts. Her books include with Maria do Mar Castro Varela, Post-Colonial Theory, A Critical Introduction, Impossible Speech on the Politics of Silence and Violence, Decolonizing Enlightenment, Transnational Justice, Human Rights, and Democracy in a Post-Colonial World, and Save Enlightenment from Europeans. Andreas Farmier. Says Andreas Farmier is a German historian. His monographs include Citizens and Aliens, Foreigners and the Law in Britain and German States, 1789 to 1870, Honorable Speculator, City Constitution, Economy and Politics in the City of London, Citizenship, The Rise and Fall of a Modern Concept, Revolutions and Reforms, Europe 1789 to 1850, Europe between Restoration, Reform, and Revolution, 1815 to 1850. Karl-Heinz Kohl. Karl-Heinz Kohl is a German ethnologist and religious scholar. Karl-Heinz Kohl is Emeritus Professor of Cultural and Ethnology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main and was Director of the Frobenius Institute for Cultural Anthropological Research from 1996 to 2016. His books include Exoticism as Profession, on the Concept of Ethnographic Experience, in B. Malinowski, E. Evans Pritchard, and Carl Levi-Strauss. Disenchanted Look, The Image of the Good Savage and the Experience of Civilization, Defense and Desire on the History of Ethnology, Ethnology, the Science of the Culturally Foreign, The Death of the Rice Maiden, Myths, Cults, and Alliances in an Eastern Indonesian Local Culture, The Power of Things, History and Theory of Sacred Objects, The Humboldt Forum and Ethnology, a conversation between Karl-Heinz Kohl, Fritz Kramer, Johann Michael Müller, Geraon Siefernich, and Gisela Folger, and Powerful Things, History and the Theory of Sacred Objects. Matthias Lutz Bachmann Matthias Lutz Bachmann is a German philosopher and professor. Don't give a shit about all his academic positions. Christ almighty. I don't even see anything for his writings. It appears like he has written something, his advisor, where he wrote something with Alfred Schmidt. Christoph Menke. It says Christoph Menke is a German philosopher and German scholar and has been a professor of philosophy in Frankfurt am Main since 2009. Christoph Menke is considered an important representative of the, quote, third generation, end quote, of the Frankfurt School. Under the section titled Research Focus, Menke works primarily on topics of political and legal philosophy, democracy and equality, history, and the concept of subjective rights, human rights, on theories of subjectivity, abilities and actions, mind and inner nature, on ethics, success and failure, theories of the tragic, and on aesthetics of modernity, tragedy, and theater. Since the summer semester of 2009, Menke has been leading the research project Normativity and Freedom in the Cluster of Excellence Normative Orders, which aims to investigate how freedom is founded as social normativity and why freedom is always at the same time freedom from social participation and thus from normativity. Against this background, particular attention is paid to the figure of subjective rights, which characterizes the form of government in modern societies. His works include The Sovereignty of Art, Aesthetic Experience after Adorno and Derrida, Moral Tragedy, Justice and Freedom according to Hegel, Reflections of Equality, Political Philosophy after Adorno and Derrida, The Presence of Tragedy, Experiment on Judgment and Play, with Arndt Pohlmann, Philosophy of Human Rights, an Introduction, Power, a Basic Concept of Aesthetic Anthropology, The Power of Art, The Critique of the Right, On the Day, I think that might be the Critique of Rights, On the Day of the Crisis, Autonomy and Liberation, Studies on Hegel, and The Theory of Liberation. Harold Müller, yeah, I can't really find anything. It looks like there's a Harold Müller. He's a historian. I don't know if this is the same guy. I guess we'll see his work. I don't know if it's the same guy, so I'm not even going to bother. We already did Sighard Neckel. Martin Zell. Come on. It says that Martin Zell is a German philosopher and university professor since 2004. He has been teaching at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. Zell is considered a representative of the, quote, third generation, end quote, of the Frankfurt School. Martin Zell has also become known since 1998 through journalistic publications. He has been retired since October 1st, 2020. And his works include The Art of Division, on the concept of aesthetic rationality, an aesthetic of nature, experiment on the form of happiness, ethical aesthetic studies, aesthetics of appearance, on the craft of philosophy, let yourself be determined, studies in theoretical and practical philosophy, Adorno's philosophy of contemplation, paradoxes of fulfillment, the power of showing up, 111 virtues, 111 vices, a philosophical review, the art of cinema, active passivity, about the scope of thinking, acting, and other arts. Ignore, quote, Hollywood, end quote, from the cinema. Not wanting to be right, mind games, games of language. And the last person in this list is Jens Steffek. See if there's Jens Steffek looks like he has some books. I'm not really seeing anything, any like bios that seem to pop out. One's called International Organization as Technocratic Utopia. One called Civil Society Participation in European and Global Governance. And others called Liberalism and Its Critics. Embedded Liberalism and Its Critics. Alright, so I apologize for reading through all of them, but I don't really feel like I'm getting much out of this if I don't look these people up. Let me reread the sentence they're all in. This approach is being intensively pursued as at the cluster of excellence, the formation of normative orders led by Rainer Forst and Klaus Günther, with further members including names like Christopher Daza, Nicole Deitelhoff, Nikita Dalwan, Andreas Farmier, Axel Honneth, Karl-Heinz Kohl, Matthias Lutz Bachmann, Christoph Menke, Harold Müller, Sighard Neckel, Martin Seal, and Jens Steffek. There exist great potentials for reactualizing a critique of modern capitalist socialization, although these have not yet been entirely formulated in concrete terms. The, quote, normative orders, end quote, approach does not argue in terms of function, but rather focuses on the, quote, internal perspectives, processes, procedures, and confrontations that influence the formation of normative orders in both action and thought, particularly in terms of the value judgments that underlie institutional orders, end quote. Normative orders serve for the, quote, justification of social rules, norms, and institutions, end quote, in simultaneously presuming and creating them, although tensions also exist between, quote, justification claims and the solidified order, end quote, itself, so that normative orders also function as, quote, justifying orders, end quote, that mediate between, quote, past, present, and future, end quote. Quote, these are factually existing, recognized, and practiced norms, which at the same time stake a claim to validity that goes beyond this simple factualness, a claim that can serve as an anchor for the critical confrontation between an existing normative order and its own ideals, end quote. However, the impulses now emanating from Frankfurt in this nascent return to the foundational considerations of critical theory before Habermas also point towards potentials beyond the analytical setting, thereby sketching out the ambition quite explicitly formulated by Honneth when he not only calls for a linkage between philosophy and social research, but also emphasizes the need for a renewed conception of social criticism. Although it is clear that the present options for a society orientation are widely divergent, with influences ranging from a negation inspired by Horkheimer and Adorno to a discourse ethics inspired by Habermas. In any case, the focus is on a, quote, integrative ambition in critical theory, end quote, in which the subject needs to be doubly considered, both as the sufferer and as the producer/reproducer of the normative orders of suffering. It is precisely through this ambivalence that the society orientation returns, as Rahel Yagi says, critical theory should contribute with ideologically critical ambitions to the, quote, critique of forms of life, end quote. In this sense, according to Yagi, there can be no equal status assumed between different subjective lifestyles, precisely because each subjective variant as a, quote, cultural and social reproduction of human life, end quote, or as a constellation of, quote, practices and orientations and orders of social behavior, end quote, itself reacts to social and political conflicts, while at the same time also inducing and thereby reproducing them. It is because subjects participate in the same order that is responsible for their own subjugation, thereby perpetuating it, that social criticism must launch its critique right here, so that it does not simply limit itself to, quote, wrestling for an appropriate conception of, quote, of criticism, end quote, but instead in a, quote, renewal of the critique of capitalism, end quote, that refers back to concrete social contexts, turn from a critical conception back to the, quote, substantial social criticism, thereby also focusing on the question as formulated by Regina Kreide of how, quote, democracy under capitalist conditions that promote extreme inequality might be rescued, end quote. Yeah, Helregi is one of those people that's like everywhere right now. Trying to see what their books are. They have a book titled Capitalism, a Conversation in Critical Theory between Nancy and Rahel Yegi. Alienation. Rahel Yegi has a book called Critique of Forms of Life. And, yeah. In this critique, according to Yegi, there can be no equal status assumed between different subjective lifestyles, precisely because each subjective variant, as a, quote, cultural and social reproduction of human life, end quote, or as a constellation of, quote, practices and orientations and orders of social behavior, end quote, itself reacts to social and political conflicts, while at the same time also inducing and thereby reproducing them. It is because subjects participate in the same order that is responsible for their own subjugation, thereby perpetuating it, that social criticism must launch its critique right here, so that it does not simply limit itself to, quote, wrestling for an appropriate conception of criticism. Shit, I already read that. What the fuck am I doing? So I'm spacing out. Okay, so that's Rahel Yegi, and the last thing I wanted to do was, holy shit, this is probably a terrible recording. Regina Kreida. Looks like she edited, amongst others, the Habermas Handbook. Also a book called Conceptualizing Power and Dynamics of Securitization Beyond State and International System. The Transformation of Democracy, Crisis, Protests, and Legitimation. Looks like there's a book in German called Habermas und der historische Materialismus, which is, I'm guessing, about Habermas and historical materialism. But, oh. Alright. Thanks for listening to, well, I'm not done. Fuck, am I on drugs or something? But yeah, I'm taking a break. New section, diverse byways. Beyond this Frankfurt highway, there also exist other byways, some loosely connected to the recent tradition of Frankfurt, some following up on the ideas of Hanover, and others remaining relatively independent, which likewise pursue the development of critical theory while also working toward critical theory's reactualization, but which today, at the start of the 21st century, can be conceptualized less in terms of geographic locality and more on the basis of intersecting thematic fields. One of the most important topics for critical theory has always been the confrontation with anti-Semitism, whose investigation still remains an active byway of critical theory at the start of the 21st century. Within social science research into anti-Semitism were not only critical theory interpretations, but also systems theories approaches as well as postmodern ones have proven to be particularly successful. The analyses presented by Detlef Clausen and Moishe Pastone are among the most influential. In his thinking, Clausen connects directly to the dialectic of enlightenment, which further deepening the analysis of the culture industry, and thus is the commodity-like interchangeability seen in the anti-Semitic projection. While Pastone concerns himself with intellectually illuminating the structural parallels between anti-Semitic thought parallels parallels between anti-Semitic thought patterns and bourgeois fetishization of goods, that should say commodities, as well as the associated antinomic unity of the abstract and the concrete. Besides the works of Samuel Salzborn, who's the author of this article, which are concerned with the attempt to integrate social science theories of anti-Semitism under the overarching strategy of considering anti-Semitism as a theory of bourgeois society itself, in order to fathom the independent relationships between individuals and structure, one should highlight the works of Lars Rensmann and Eva Maria Siga, who have each presented differing reconstructions of anti-Semitism's significance in the deliberations of critical theory, whereby Rensmann had additionally advanced a deeper analysis of the relationship between critical theories about anti-Semitism and developments in political culture. While the main references here are primarily to Adorno, both Stefan Grigat and Gerhard Scheidt additionally make considerable reference to Neumann in their investigations of anti-Semitic and totalitarian socialization under Islam, especially in regards to Iran. Since the anti-Semitic individual as the embodiment of the Enlightenment's barbaric potentials has always been discounted as a subject for critical theory research into anti-Semitism has primarily had a society orientation in its analysis. So I'm going to look up some of these people, even though some of them I already have things on the channel, or at least read their works. So, for instance, Samuel Salzborn says, is a German social scientist. Since August 2020, has been full-time anti-Semitism commissioner for the state of Berlin. Salzborn's research focuses on political theory and the history of ideas, democracy and right-wing extremism research, political sociology, and methodological teaching. I'm just going to read his... it says that there's a section here. This is from the German Wikipedia. Salzborn's book, Collective Innocence, was published in 2020 on the topic of, quote, not coming to terms with National Socialism, end quote. The defense of the Shoah in German memory. Salzborn writes, the history of guilt and defense against memory, the perpetrator-victim reversal, self-stylization as a victim, and anti-Semitic projection have always been ignored in the German self-image. Even 75 years after the suppression of National Socialism, a self-critical reappraisal of the past has hardly taken place on a social level. The defense against the Shoah in German memory manifests a self-image that revolves around the myth of collective innocence. Coming to terms with the Nazi past, saying goodbye to one's own victim myth, and coming to terms with the anti-Semitic perpetrators in almost all family histories in the Federal Republic are the biggest lie of the Federal Republic, the belief in an actual coming to terms with the past. Salzborn criticizes the fact that there was a consensus-like reference to a German victim myth from the beginning, both publicly and privately. This begins in the early debates in the German Bundestag about the question of the impunity laws of 1954, and in the self-dramatizations, especially in feature films of the 50s and 60s, such as Dogs, Do You Want to Live Forever?, The Devil's General, The Bridge, and others. It was partly broken by the series Holocaust, the story of the Weiss family, and later by Schindler's List and Life is Beautiful, but also set back massively by Die Gustloff, Downfall, Our Mothers, Our Fathers. I've never seen Downfall. I'd like to see all these movies. I've seen Schindler's List, and I've seen that's it. But I just want to read his works real quick, Salzborn's works. Boundless Homeland, History, Present, and Future of the Displaced Peoples Associations. It says Antifa edition. Elephant Press, Berlin, 2000. Homeland Law and Ethnic Struggle, Foreign Policy Concepts of Displaced Persons, Associations with and their Practical Implementation. With other people. He wrote a piece, something called "Issues of the Right, Issues of the Middle, Immigration, Demographic Change, and National Consciousness." Ethnicization of Politics, Theory and History of Ethnic Group Law in Europe. Shared Memory, German-Czech Relations, and the Sudeten-German Past. Anti-Semitism as a Negative Central Idea of Modernity, Social Science Theories and Comparison. Democracy, Theories, Forms, Developments. Social Sciences for Introduction, Right-Wing Extremism, Manifestation and Approaches to Explanation, Anti-Semitism, History, Theory, Empiricism, Battle of Idea, The History of Political Theories and Context, Attack of the Anti-Democrats, The Ethnic Rebellion of the New Right, Global Anti-Semitism, A Search for Clues in the Abyss of Modernity, Collective Innocence, The Defense of the Shoah and German Memory, Theories of Anti-Semitism and Defenseless Democracy, Anti-Semitism and the Threat to the Political Order. So that's one. That's Salzborn. Detlef Clausen, born 1948, is a German journalist and sociologist. I do have a piece of him on this channel. It says his work focuses on the study of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, nationalism, racism, transformation societies, migration movements, and psychoanalysis. And a list of his publications is, as editor, Traces of Liberation, Herbert Marcuse, a material book to introduce his political thinking, 1981, The Cunning of Violence, Social Revolutions and Their Theories, 1982, Goodbye to Yesterday, Critical Theory Today, Bremen, 1986, Small Frankfurt School of Food and Drink, 1990, Limits of Enlightenment, The Social Genesis of Modern Anti-Semitism, 1987. As an editor, he edited From Hatred of Jews to Anti-Semitism, Materials of a Denied History, 1987. Under Pressure to Conform, on the Relationship Between Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis, 1988. With a Heart of Stone, Political Essays, 1969 to 1989, published in 1989. Looking Back at Lenin, 1990. What Does Racism Mean, 1994. Failed Liberation on the Ethnicizing Dissolution of Real Socialism, 1994. The Banalization of Evil About Auschwitz, Everyday Religion and Social Theory, 1995. Hanoverian Writings, Aspects of Everyday Religion, Criticism of Ideology Under Changing Social Conditions, published in 2000. Theodor W. Adorno, A Last Genius, published in 2003. Bella Gutmann, World History of Football in One Person, published in 2006. The Concrete Cosmopolitanism in Football in the 21st Century, Detlef Clausen in conversation with Diethelm Blecking, 2010. It's Detlef Clausen. Everyone knows who Moïse Pistone is. I just want to read if they have a list of his works. This is a nice thing. That's one of the merits of German Wikipedia, is that it has like a pretty good like bibliography at the end. Can't find anything. But Pistone's main book is Time, Labor, and Social Domination. published in 1993. Lars Rensman. I have a piece by Lars Rensman on the channel on anti-Semitism. There we are. Lars Rensman. Lars Rensman, born 1970, is a German political scientist and university professor. From 2012 to 2015, Rensman was associate professor of political science at John Cabot University in Rome. From 2016 to 2022, he is professor of European politics and society at the University of Groningen. Since 2022, Lars Rensman has held the chair of political science with a focus on comparative government at the University of Passau. And the list of his works are Critical Theory of Anti-Semitism, Studies on Structure, Explanatory Potential, and Topicality, published in 1998, with Micha Brumlich and Hajo Funke. Contested Forgetting, Walser Debate, Holocaust Denial in Modern German Historical Policy, 2000. Democracy in the Image of Jews, Anti-Semitism in the Political Culture of the Federal Republic of Germany, with Susanna Fröhlich-Stephan. Populist in Power, Populist Government Parties in Western and Eastern Europe, published in 2005, with Andrei S. Markovits, Cross-Paths, Sport and Politics in Europe and the USA, with Julius H. Schupps, Gideon Botch, Christoph Kopke. He edited the volume Right-Wing Extremism in Brandenburg, Handbook for Analysis, Prevention, and Intervention, among others, with Jörg Schönbaum. With Julius H. Schupps, he edited Image of the Enemy of Judaism, Anti-Semitism in Europe in 2008. With Gideon Botch, Christoph Kopke, he edited Politics of Hate Studies on Anti-Semitism and Right-Wing Extremism in 2009. With Julius H. Schupps, Gideon Botch, Christoph Kopke, he edited Politics of Hate, Anti-Semitism, and the Radical Right in Europe, 2010. With Andrei S. Markovits, Gaming the World, How Sports Are Reshaping Global Politics and Culture, published in 2010. I believe that's in English, translated in English. With Julius H. Schupps, he edited Politics and Resentment, Anti-Semitism, and Counter-Cosmopolitanism in the European Union. With Stefan Hagemann and Hajo Funke, he edited or wrote Authoritarianism and Democracy, Political Theory and Culture and Global Modernity. With Samir Gandesha, Arendt and Adorno, he edited Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations. The Politics of Unreason, the Frankfurt School and the Origins of Modern Anti-Semitism. And The Mobilization of Resentment, on the Analysis of Anti-Semitism in the AfD, which is the Alternative for Deutschland. So that's Lars Rensman. Eva Maria Siga. So this is Eva Maria Siga, born 1961, is a German sociologist and professor of political sociology. Her teaching and research focuses on social theory, history of ideas, political sociology, history of science, and Jewish studies. She is internationally known primarily for anti-Semitism research and research on critical theory. Her monographs include Anti-Semitism and Social Theory, The Frankfurt School and American Exile, published in 2009, Mythical Coherence, Discourse Analysis of Ethnic Anti-Semitism, 2002. She edited Theodore W. Adorno, Comments on the Authoritarian Personality, and other texts. on the criticism of regressive reason, contributions to the, quote, dialectics of enlightenment, end quote. The Field of Frankfurt Cultural and Social Sciences After 1945 with Richard Faber, published in 2008. After 1945, published in 2008. The Field of Frankfurt Cultural and Social Sciences Before 1945, published in 2007. And The Moving Prejudice, Aspects of International Anti-Semitism, published in 2004. I have a piece by Eva Maria Siga, on this channel. Stefan Grigat, I have a couple pieces by him. He was one of the first people who, I heard, and he puts it in he's a very extreme thesis, so I would be more cautious than him. And some of the things, some of his support for Israel seems, at least like the some of the statements he makes are very provocative and maybe a little too extreme, but maybe I don't understand him. But I think he also says at the same time very interesting things. So Stefan Grigat, born 1971 in West Berlin, is a German political scientist and journalist. Grigat has been professor of theories and criticism of anti-Semitism at the Catholic University of North Rhine-Westphalia since 2022, heads the Center for Anti-Semitism and Racism Studies, KARS, in Aachen. In 2007, he co-founded the Stop the Bomb campaign, for which he served as scientific director in Austria until 2021. Since 2017, Grigat has been a research fellow at the Herzl Institute for the Study of Zionism at the University of Haifa. Since 2022, at the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. It says, at the center of Grigat's interest is the topic of anti-Semitism and its relationship to the tradition of the left and to Islam. Philosophically, Grigat sees himself in the tradition of Marx and critical theory, which he sees in contrast to traditional Marxism and the left-wing mainstream. Other important authors for him are Oscar Wilde, Johannes Agnoli, Moshe Pistone, and Guy Debord. It says, there's a section on his positions. As a central point of criticism of the traditional left, Grigat formulates the accusation of anti-Semitism, which can be traced back to the early socialists. The early writings of Karl Marx and letters from Marx and Engels also contain formulations and arguments that rely on anti-Semitic cliches. Marx's early criticism of capitalism lacked the sharpness of concepts that would counteract resentment in his later criticism of political economy. In the European workers' movement, anti-Semitism was repeatedly denied, trivialized, and in the worst cases openly propagated as consistent anti-capitalism. The Stalinist campaigns against Zionism and cosmopolitanism can be considered the most radical form of left-wing anti-Semitism. The October Revolution led by Lenin initially brought the Russian Jews numerous advantages compared to the Tsarist era. However, Stalin had already used anti-Semitism as a tool in the fight for Lenin's successor. Stalin later changed from a tactical to a convinced anti-Semite who, at the end of his life, considered forcibly relocating Soviet Jews. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union supported the project of establishing the Israeli state for a short time. By the end of the 1940s, however, anti-Zionism became the official state doctrine. In Western Europe, the left's anti-Semitism after the Second World War expressed itself as anti-Zionism after the Six-Day War, 1967. This soon spread to large parts of the left and was most evident in the Federal Republic of Germany. Quote, from the left-wing Social Democrats, the Greens and Alternatives, feminist groups, K groups, autonomist and anti-imperialists to the armed groups, end quote. Criticism of Islamism. Grigat criticizes anti-Semitism as an essential component of Islamist ideology. In his view, the greatest anti-Semitic threat is currently the Iranian regime, whose boycott he is strongly committed to. He is a co-founder of the Stop the Bomb campaign, which he warns against Iran's nuclear armaments plans and calls on German and Austrian components to end their business relationships with Iran. He particularly criticized OMV's planned billion-dollar deal with Iran, which in his view would, quote, make Austria the long-term strategic partner of the mullahs regime in Tehran. So here are some of his works: Fetishism and Freedom, on the reception of Marxist fetish criticism, the emancipation of the state and capital, and the criticism of anti-Semitism, and published in 2007. And the Loneliness of Israel, Zionism, the Israeli Left, and the Iranian Threat, 2014. He edited a volume with Andreas Stahl, Jakob Hoffmann, and Mark Soyle, Remembering as the Highest Form of Forgetting, Reinterpretations of the Holocaust and the, quote, Historians Controversy 2.0. Criticism of Anti-Semitism in the Present, Manifestations, Theories, Combat. Iran, Israel, Germany, Anti-Semitism, Foreign Trade, and the Nuclear Program. AFD and FPU. I don't know if I'm saying that right. FPO. Anti-Semitism, Ethnic Nationalism, and Gender Images. Post-Nazism Revisited, the Afterlife of National Socialism in the 21st Century. Iran and the World System, Alliances of the Regime, and Perspectives of the Freedom Movement. Iran, Analysis of an Islamic Dictatorship and its European Sponsors. Enemy, Renaissance, and Re-Education, Critical Theory Against Post-Nazism and Islamism. 2006. Spectacle Art Society, Guy Debord and the Situationist International. 2006. Transformation of Post-Nazism, the German-Austrian Path to Democratic Fascism. 2003. Anti-Semitism, Special Issue, Path and Designation, Marxist Magazine, Volume 56, Number 2, 1998. So, that's what we got. Check out some of Gugat's stuff if you're interested on that's just like or Gugat stuff. Gerhard Scheidt. Gerhard Scheidt was a part of the Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism network, also with people like Moishe Pastone and Robert Fine. It says Gerhard Scheidt, born 1959 in Vienna, is an Austrian author and essayist. After studying music, Scheidt studied theater studies, German studies, philosophy, and music in Vienna and Berlin. Scheidt has taught at several universities in Austria and lives as a freelance author and essayist in Vienna. His research focus was initially on the history of drama and musical drama, as well as anti-Semitism in literary and music theory since the mid-1990s, on studies on a critical theory of constitutional and international law. Based on Theodor W. Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Franz Neumann, Scheidt considers Marx's critique of political economy as well as Freud's psychoanalysis as a prerequisite for socially critical analysis. Scheidt places particular emphasis on the concept of the racket. Scheidt wrote the entry for the racket in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. In the 1990s, Scheidt published regularly in the magazine Beton and later especially in the anti-German magazine Bahamas and on the website Café Critique. In 2012, together with Manfred Dahlmann, he founded the Journal for Ideological Criticism, which increasingly focuses on the criticism of existentialism and is published by the Freiburg and Vienna publishing houses K. Ihre Verlag. Scheidt edited several volumes of the edition of the writer Jean Amory's work published by Klett Cotta. In 2016, Gerhard Scheidt received the Theodor Kramer Prize together with Stefan Horvath. And I'm just going to read some of the books that he's written. In 1988, he wrote, using the example of Brecht and Bronnen, Crisis and Criticism of Modern Drama, Theater and Revolutionary Humanism, a study of Jura Seufer, 1988, Franz Grill Parzer, 1994, Gender Dramaturgy on the Shared History of Drama and Opera, Waste Separation, 1998, Hanswurst and the State, A Little History of Comedy, 1999, The Master of the Crisis on the Connection Between Human Destruction and National Prosperity, 2001, Suicide Attack on the Criticism of Political Violence, 2004. Hidden State Living Memory on the Dramaturgy of Anti-Semitism, 2006. Jargon of Democracy About the New Behemoth, 2007. The Delusion of World Sovereignty on the Criticism of International Law. Torturous Body Critique of Society according to Adorno. Criticism of Political Engagement, 2016. In the Ant Colony From Wagner's Redemption to Badiou's Event, 2017. With Marx, 12 partly scholastic attempts to criticize political economy, 2022. And he was the co-author with Monica Meyer and Peter Rüssler, Theater, Science, and Fascism, self-published 1982, with Peter Rüssler, Theater and Fascism, 1984, The Interrogated Gender on the Crisis of Power in Heinrich von Kleist's Dialogue, with Walter Paas and Wilhelm Svoboda, Orpheus in Exile, Expulsion of Austrian Music, 1938 to 1945, published in 1995, with Wilhelm Svoboda, Image of the Enemy of Gustav Mahler on the anti-Semitic defense of modernity in Austria, and with Wilhelm Svoboda, Meeting Point of Modernity, Gustav Mahler, Theodor W. Adorno, Viennese Traditions, 2010. So, these are some of those characters. It is particularly thanks to the intellectual influence of Ingeborg Maus that legal theory not only survives, this is back to the text, not only survives as a byway of critical theory, but has also become a focal topic once again, naturally drawing upon Neumann and Kirchheimer as well, but also integrating approaches by people like Antonio Gramsci and Nikos Palantzas. For example, one important forum for critical theory that has endured during the decades is the magazine Kritische Justiz, which, while also integrating other approaches, has always facilitated the use of social criticism and its role as a bridge builder in legal theory too, thanks to authors such as Joachim Perels, which I might have already looked up already, but I forget already. Yes, I did. I already looked that guy up, so he's earlier in the piece. Rainer Ert, and Jürgen Seifert. Among others, Kritische Justiz, I don't know how to say that. Justiz, I don't know. German for justice, has been remarkable in successfully accomplishing a general transition, today appearing as an innovative publication with interventional capabilities, and one whose creativity offers much potential for critical theory. In terms of recent critical legal theory, and particularly notable works include those of Andreas Fischer-Lescano, Andreas Fizan, and Sonia Buckle. The goal of this critical legal theory is to understand law as a resource for enabling social emancipation, and one that arises neither as an end in itself nor from within an apolitical justifying framework, but instead in its dialectics always represents an expression of the relevant social and political conflicts. This deep connection to critical theory's basic ambivalence between a subject orientation and a society orientation is succinctly highlighted in Sonia Buckle and regard to the legal analysis of migration policy. Quote, "There are no good migration policies, only less bad ones," end quote. In the context of global legal theory and democracy theory, one should also highlight the works of Regina Kreide, who I already looked up, and Hauke Bronkhorst, who I already looked up, who borrow more from Habermas than from Mauss, as they focus on questions of international and transnational justice, thereby also emphasizing the law's potential for empowering the subject, as well as the idea of a global justice. This also brings up the question of the relationship between positive law versus political/social legal claims, along with the associated fields of conflict, as well as the relationship between material rights and the real world, and not just formal legitimation. Although the critique of political economy was always implicit in the analysis of Adorno and Horkheimer, but rarely the explicit focus, the pursuit of this trajectory opens up yet another critical theory perspectives. Other critical theory perspectives. Important examples would be the works of Klaus Offer, Wolfgang Streeck, and Alex Demirovich, who, despite their very different analyses, always connect considerations of democratic theory to materially oriented social theory, and who investigate the shifting relationships between democracy and capitalism as well as the social and global division of labor, while working from a social criticism approach that strives for the broadening of participation. Only person I'm going to look up here is Demirovich. These Klaus Alpha and Wolfgang Streeck are too well known for that to be necessary here. The basic idea here is that political and social processes under capitalism are pre-structured by economic dominance, thereby generating mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion that create effective limits on participation. Demirovich goes on to emphasize the need for, quote, self-reflection on the concrete scholarly practice of emancipatory, enlightenment-oriented thought within society's division of labor, end quote, essential in tackling this topic. Ever since the second wave of the women's movement, feminism has certainly had critical implications in general, but for the most part, these were never part of critical theory, which is largely due to a foundational problem. While the feminist goals of the political women's movement and of academic feminist theory have always aimed at making critical and concrete improvements in the life situations of women, it was the negative society orientation of critical theory that made it particularly difficult to make a connection. In Adorno's paradigm, there cannot be a right life amidst wrongs, but this stands in direct contradiction to the feminist goal of improving the lives of women in the here and now. However, this seeming contradiction is only a spurious one, since critical theory considers the subject orientation to be just as central as the society orientation, and also is mentioned to be just as genuinely marked by ambivalence, which is demonstrated by the work of critical theorists like Regina Becker-Schmidt and Gudrun Alexi Knapp in particular. For them, besides the critique of Horkheimer's, quote, androcentric and motherhood idealizing tendencies, end quote, the main focus is on recognizing the, quote, double socialization, end quote, of women, where, contrary to general myth, women's wage-earning work and reproductive work are not the exception, but actually the rule in historical terms, meaning that women are indeed doubly tied to frameworks of social reproduction. Therefore, an ongoing concern in feminist-oriented critical theory is to investigate the, quote, aspect of dominance in the relationship between the genders as well as the nature of male and female subjectivities, end quote, while also relating this to the central ambivalence of public versus private, which is so central to feminist scholarship. Another byway that should be highlighted is the field of political psychology, which has strong connections to Hanover, but has also established once again points of contact with Frankfurt and its SFI. Although it remains to be seen whether a, quote, critical theory of the subject, end quote, and can be successfully reestablished, one should mention here the works of Alfred Krovosa, Rolf Pohl, Hans-Dieter Koenig, and Hans-Joachim Busch, who I'll refer back to, while also further developing a critical theory that is psychoanalytically engaged, and thereby primarily aims at a subject orientation that does not mean to simply reduce the suffering of the subject, but also tries to focus attention back firstly onto the individual who at the same time is understood as having been socialized. Here too, like in most of the other aforementioned fields, one cannot claim that there exists any homogeneous reference framework, even among just the 4 authors listed. And the connections and further development are becoming ever widening, as seen in the works of Jan Lohl, Lohl, and Sebastian Winter. Nonetheless, the political psychology orientation does reflect certain common concerns, such as investigating bourgeois socialization and thereby the modern ambivalences and inner conflicts resulting from the dialectic of enlightenment that burden the subject, ultimately giving voice to the general within the subjective. In other words, connecting the subject orientation to the society orientation while also making visible, especially in their historicity and genealogy, the concentration of powers within bourgeois society and how these are inscribed into subjective processes of negotiation, thus highlighting the mutually referential relationship between subject and society, particularly on the level of the unconscious. A somewhat unconventional byway of critical theory at the start of the 21st century is represented by 2 projects that are significant not so much because of common thematic focus, but because of their shared methodological concern with building, integrating connections between different approaches, from social criticism and/or critical theory, the Zeitschrift für kritische Sozialtheorie und Philosophie, quote, magazine for critical social theory and philosophy, end quote, and the Zeitschrift für kritische Theorie, magazine for critical theory. Alright, so that's the end of that section, so I'm going to look up some of these people that I've referenced. Rainer Ert, born 1944, is a German lawyer specializing in information and data protection law. His pieces include American Unions in the New Deal, 1933 to 1937, published in 1896, Online Quite Compact, From the Domain to Download, Guide for Internet Users, published in 2000, Film and Television Law, From Script to Film, 2007, with Michael Rebstock, The Product and Brand Piracy in China, published in 2010, Improved and Watered Down EU General Data Protection Regulation and Federal Data Protection Act. Tony Lakatosh, Just Don't Call Me Artist, published in 2020, and Barrel House Jazz Band, The Untold Story, 2022, and he edited Cultural City, Frankfurt Scenes, Institutions, Positions in 1990, and Passionate About Labor Law, Experiences of a Troubled Generation, 2009. I think I might have already looked this guy up. Jürgen Seifert was a German lawyer, political scientist, and civil rights activist. His books include Danger Imminent on the Problem of Emergency Legislation, published in 1963, Emergency Committee, published 1968, Der Spiegel Affair, 2 volumes, 1966, Struggle for Constitutional Positions, Materials for Determining the Limits and Possibilities of Legal Policy, published in 1974, Basic Law and Restoration, Constitutional Analysis and Documentary Presentation of the Text of the Basic Law of May 23, 1949, with all amendments including the 34th Amendment Act, 1974. 1984, Already Today, Who is Afraid of the Federal Office of the Protection of the Constitution? For the Protection of the Constitution. 1984, I guess, being a reference to the book 1984. That's published in 1976. And Politics Between Destruction and Creation, Studies on Policy Change, published in 1997. He added book chapters such as, and magazine articles such as The Fight for Constitutional Positions, Wolfgang Abendroth on his 60th birthday, 1966, The Left in the SPD, 1945 to 1968, published in 1976, House of Forum, Value System or Open Constitutional Order, published in 1979. Theorist of the Counter-Revolution, Carl Schmitt, 1888 to 1895, published in 1985. From the quote 58 to the quote 68, a biographical review, published in 1993. Joachim Ritter's Collegium Philosophicum, a Forum of Open Thinking, published in 2000. The Circle of Fire and the Strange Experiences in the Youth Movement of the Post-War Period, published in 2001. It looks like he's written things with Oscar Necht and Michael Buchmüller, who was like the expert on Karl Korsch in Germany. Moving on. Andres Fischer Lescano, born 1972, is a German legal scholar. From 2008 to 2022, he was a professor of the University of Bremen with research focused on public law, European law, international law, legal theory, and legal policy. In 2022, he moved to the University of Kassel and took up a professorship in the Just Transitions Department. His works include Global Constitution, The Justification for the Validity of Human Rights, published in 2005. Regime Clashes on the Fragmentation of Global Law, together with Günther Teubner, published in 2006. The Whole of Law, from a Hierarchical to a Reflexive Understanding of German and European Fundamental Rights, published in 2007. With Kolja Müller, he wrote The Fight for Global Social Rights, Delicate Would Be the Worst Thing, published in 2012, and Legal Force, published in 2013. It says Hegemony Armored with Coercion, Civil Society and Politics, and Antonio Gramsci's Understanding of the State, published in 2007. Gutenberg, or the, quote, Victory of Silence, end quote, published in 2012. The State of Class Society, Legal and Social Welfare, with Wolfgang Abendroth, Understanding the State, Volume 51, edited with Joachim Perls and Thilo Schola. Critical Systems Theory on the Evolution of a Normative Theory, published in 2013. Law and Politics of Global Security, Inventory and Approaches to Explanation. Constitutionality of the Minimum Wage, published in 2015. And with Sonja Buckel, Ralf Christensen, New Theories of Law, published in 2020. It says Andreas Fison. Andreas Fison, born 1960, is a German legal scholar. Since 2004, he's been professor of public law, environmental and technical law, and legal theory at Bielefeld University. His monographs include Rules in Transition, Reflections on a Critical Theory of the State, published in 2008, Unleash Democracy, Not Markets, Arguments for a Post-Capitalist Economy and Society, published in 2010, The Seeds of Cadmus, State, Democracy, and Capitalism, published in 2016, Behind Closed Doors, Democracy Halved, Prevent an Authoritarian State, Expand Participation, 2017, State Law and Democracy on the Political Thought of Marx and Engels, 2018, with Hermann Mahler, Peter Wahl, and Thomas Eberhard Küster, EU in Crisis, Background, Causes, Alternatives. He edited a volume with Ridvan Sifty, Read After, Introductory and Further Text on the Materialist Theory of the State, Democracy, and Law, published in 2019. Repressive Tolerance and Market-Compliant Democracy on the Development of the Rule of Law and Democracy in the Federal Republic, published in 2021. And Eloy Stiegeleru and Manfred Bratz, Above, Below, Right, and Left, a slightly different introduction to political color theory, published in 2023. His essays include Asylum Law and the New World Order, published in 1992, Security and Self-Interest, Reflections on Recent Developments in Repression and Surveillance, published in 2008, Key Points of Progressive Legal Policy in Times of Eroding Democratic Standards, published in 2012, with Ridvan Sifsi, CETA, and TTIP, some critical comments, and Essential Questions of a Constitutional Complaint Against CETA, published in 2016. Sonia Buckle, we already looked her up, right? I'm not sure. I don't know if I've read her. I'll read her books real quick. She wrote Subject and Cohesion Towards the Reconstruction of a Materialist Theory of Law. Okay, yeah, so she's the one that wrote the book. It's the Historical Materialism book series. Quote, Welcome to Europe, end quote, Limits of Legal Migration Law, Legal Disputes about the, quote, European State Project, end quote, 2013, together with Judith Cope, quote, The Right Not to Have to Leave, end quote, an analysis of the European, quote, combating the causes of flight, end quote, in the context of global inequality, and with Judith Cope, Causes of Flight, The Right Not to Have to Go, and the Politics of Europe, 2022. She edited as an editor, she helped edit New Theories of Law, published in 2006, with Andreas Fischer-Lescano, Hegemony Armored with Coercion, Politics and Civil Society, and Antonio Gramsci's Understanding of the State, with Johannes Angermüller and Margit Rodrian Fenning, Solidarity in Education, Crossover, Experiments in Self-Organized Knowledge Production, with Lucas Urbendorfer, Axel Troost, Andre Ispilanti, Solidarity Europe Mosaic Perspectives, published in 2013, with research group State Project Europe, Fights Over Migration Policy, Theory, Method, and Analyses of Critical European Research, 2014, with Laura Graf, Judith Cope, Neva Louv, Maximilian Kirk, Fights for Migration Policy since 2015 on the transformation of the European immigration regime. You probably might be familiar with Alex Dimirovich. He's more common to Marxist thinking. But that's it. Lines of connection, not commonalities. Axel Honneth in the differentiating lines of development in critical theory since Adorno highlighted three variants which Honneth called the, quote, radicalization of negativism, end quote, the, quote, orientation around social movements, end quote, and the, quote, revision of basic concepts, end quote. While the first variant refers to ideas that are similar to those behind by my proposed society orientation, the other two variants in Honneth's categorization represent a further subdivision of my proposed subject orientation. The point could perhaps be exaggerated by comparing this to the difference between the subject orientation of Knecht versus that of Habermas. Interestingly, the systematization of the history of critical theory since Adorno is very similarly conceived by Gudrun Alexi Knapp in regard to feminist treatments, in a, quote, simultaneity full of tensions, end quote. Knapp sees a differentiation between approaches that connect either to considerations of the, quote, social forcefulness of instrumentalized reason, end quote, coming close to my proposed society orientation, or to considerations with interdisciplinary intentions of the, quote, self-image of critical theory as an element of political practice, end quote, similar to my proposed subject orientation. Without wanting to thereby construct artificial distinctions between Honneth and Knapp, it can nonetheless be said that while each has different accentuations in describing the developmental history of critical theory, they can both be embraced within my two main lines of development in critical theory at the start of the 21st century. Certainly, my proposed systemization is a simplification and less complex than those of Honneth or Knapp, Nevertheless, it would seem to offer systematic opportunities for localizing the process of differentiation that influence the ambivalent constellations of critical theory, while also facilitating an understanding of the developmental history behind the emergence of certain theoretical divergences that now, at the start of the 21st century, seem to lie farther apart from one another than would otherwise be the case if they were understood not only as temporary endpoints in the historical reconstruction of a developmental trajectory, but also as optionalities, quote, emphatically dependent on context, end quote, within a dialectical ambivalence. The terms that we use in conceptualizing, analyzing, and critiquing are, quote, worn out, end quote, says Detlef Clausen, meaning that a critical theory of society can be renewed only by working on the core issues themselves and not just on the discourses. A theory, in order to constantly prove the, quote, standards of its critical thinking, end quote, must always be able to self-critically turn back to itself and its own, quote, blind spots and exclusions, end quote, says Rainer Forst. Also because the two orientations will likely never agree on the relevance of their respective theoretical discourses, and this is not precisely where one might find a contemporary core truth about the ambitions of critical theory upon which bridges could better be built without necessarily equating lines of connection and commonalities. In fact, the difference in suppositions is ultimately a difference in the reference to the other, whether it be formulated substantially or discursively, whose variance could finally be understood due to the negative postulate of critical social theory, not only as a deviation, but also as an ambivalence. The end. Thanks for listening. The actual end this time, not just the end of me reading before I take a break, but the end of the reading.